Raven's Knot by Robin Jarvis. Read by Nicholas Grace. "5 miles outside Glastonbury. Brindled with frost, the plough-churned soil of the Somerset levels was bare and black. In the wild, empty country, safely concealed by the dark, the noise of great wings travelled across the sky, free at last of the tethers that had kept them bound for so many ages. Horror and dread spread across the dim landscape which separated Wells and Glastonbury. A fox darted for cover, tearing in blind panic towards a thicket of hawthorn. It lay there panting feverishly, straining to catch the slightest sound upon the winter airs. But the unnatural clamour that so alarmed the fox had already faded, and a more familiar noise was growing. Over the icy road a car swept. Inside the vehicle, mellow music issued from the radio. Resting her head upon her husband's shoulder, a pretty young woman murmured the few lyrics she remembered. Her voice stopped as she felt him tense, and she lifted her head in surprise. "Tom, what is it?" A frown creased the man's forehead. "Shh," he said. "Hazel, did you hear that?" He was gazing up through the windscreen at the pitch-black sky. "Tom," she ventured, "there isn't anything." "There is," he said emphatically. "Hazel, it was weird, sort of screaming, but it wasn't quite human." Then, from the night it tumbled, hurtling down with ferocious force. A mighty limb of ancient oak came plummeting towards them. Screaming, Hazel threw her arms before her face as the vehicle shuddered beneath the vicious impact, and the tires skidded upon the icy road. With a lurch, the spin ended. "It might have killed us," Hazel whispered. Tom made no reply. His heart was pounding in his chest, and his eyes widened as he stared upwards. "My God," he whimpered. High above them the sky was filled with a terrible yammering. There came the beating of gigantic wings, and the roof buckled as large dents were punched in the metal beneath the weight of many descending objects. Into the car, curving under the roof, there came a great and savage claw which gripped the contorted metal, and the vehicle was shaken violently. Like a tin of peaches, the car was opened. For a moment, as they were dragged into the air, Tom's and Hazel's screams equaled the vile, raucous laughter of the foulness which had captured them. Then the two human voices were silenced, and once the feast was over, the night was disturbed only by a slow, contented flapping as dark, sinister shapes took to the air. A force dormant for centuries was loose once more. The first of the 12 were abroad, and in the days that were to follow, their numbers would increase. Over the East End of London, a bright moon gleamed down upon the Wyrd Museum. Behind the first-floor windows, a fiery portal guttered and crackled. The separate collection, and everything it had housed, were almost completely destroyed. Smouldering scars scored the oak panelling of the walls, blasted and ripped by blistering bolts of energy that had shot from the center of the gateway. From those sizzling wounds, living branches had sprouted, and now the room resembled a clearing in a forest. Neil Chapman was drained and weary. Together with the teddy bear, in whose form resided the soul of an American airman, he had been sent back to the Second World War to recapture Belial, a demon that had escaped from the museum. But Ted had not returned to the present. "Blood and sand," Neil's father spluttered. "What's been going on?" Miss Ursula Webster, eldest of the three sisters who owned the Wyrd Museum, eyed the destruction with her glittering eyes as she contained her anger. "Mr. Chapman, you must begin the restoration of this collection as soon as possible. Such treasures must not be left lying around in this disgraceful manner." Her two wizened sisters were fussing over a young girl. Miss Celandine Webster, with her overripe apple face, was grinning her toothiest smile. At her side, Miss Veronica was trilling happily, her countenance a startling sight, covered as it was by a thick layer of beauty cream. Edie Dorkins, the small girl brought from the time of the Blitz to the present by the power of the Websters, took little notice. Upon her head, the green woolen pixie hood, a gift from the sisters, sparkled as the light caught the strands of silver tinsel woven into the stitches. Picking her way through the debris, Miss Ursula took the youngster's grubby hand. I have said that you are to be our daughter, Edith, dear. As this is the hour of your joining with us, it is only fitting that you are shown our greatest treasure at once." With her gown billowing around her, Miss Ursula strode swiftly from the separate collection, and Edie Dorkins, her eyes dancing, ran after her. Miss Celandine and Miss Veronica followed. Alone with his sons, the dumbfounded Mr. Chapman gazed around. "I don't understand," he murmured. "Neil, what happened here? Who was that scruffy kid?" But if Brian Chapman was expecting any answers, he quickly saw that none was forthcoming. Neil's face was haggard, and his eyelids were drooping. Remembering that it was past 3 in the morning, the caretaker of the Wyrd Museum lifted Josh, Neil's younger brother, into his arms. "I'd best get the pair of you to bed," he said. "You can tell me in the morning." Down the stairs Miss Ursula led Edie, down past a great square window, through which a shaft of silver moonlight came slanting into the building. "Are you ready, Edith?" the elderly woman asked, her voice trembling with anticipation when they reached the claustrophobic hallway at the foot of the staircase. The girl nodded in the gloom. The panelling of the hall was crowded with dingy watercolours. "Here we are," Miss Ursula murmured, "at the beginning of your new life." Solemnly, she stepped over to one of the panels and rapped her knuckles upon it. With a juddering motion, a section of the wall began to slide into a hidden recess. "The mechanism is worn and ancient," Miss Ursula confessed. "In the last 100 years, I have used it seldom." Edie found herself looking at a low archway set into an ancient wall. She studied the wooden door that was framed by it. Its stout timbers were black with age, yet they were as solid as the stone which surrounded them. At the bottom of the door there was a wide crack where the timbers had shrunk away from the floor, and a faint mouldering scent entwined around her. The tinsel threads woven into her pixie hood glittered as the haunting odour captivated her. Miss Ursula lit an oil lamp which stood upon a small table, then took from a chain about her neck a delicate silver key. But before turning it in the lock, she hesitated. "Now," she uttered gravely, "you will learn the secret which my sisters and I have guarded these countless years. Prepare yourself, Edith. Once you have beheld this wonder, your destiny will be bound unto it forever." Without taking her silvery blue eyes from the doorway, the girl said simply, "Open it." Then she held her breath as Miss Ursula grasped the handle and pushed. The ancient door swung inwards. At once the stale air grew more pungent. Holding the lamp aloft, Miss Ursula ducked beneath the low archway. The light illuminated the ground and showed it to be the topmost step of a steep flight. "Have a care, Edith," Miss Ursula warned. "The unnumbered footfalls of my sisters and I have rendered each step murderously smooth." Down the plummeting tunnel Miss Ursula went. Edie followed close behind. Deep into the earth the stairway delved, twisting a spiralling path beneath the foundations of the Wyrd Museum. At one point, a length of copper pipe, encrusted with verdigris, projected across the tunnel. "So do the roots of the modern world reach down to the past," Miss Ursula remarked. "Thus far they have not discovered us, yet a day may come when these steps are unearthed. If man were to know of the terrors which wait to seize control of his domain, he would undoubtedly destroy it himself in his madness. This is what we must save them from, Edith. They must never know of us and our guardianship." Further down they travelled, until Edie lost all sense of time and could not begin to measure the distance they had come. "Pay extra heed here," Miss Ursula cautioned abruptly. "The steps are about to end." They had come to a large gateway which was wrought from some tarnished metal. Miss Ursula reached out to touch it with her fingertips. "Behind this barrier is a most hallowed thing," she murmured with reverence. "Throughout the lonely ages my sisters and I have served, and now you too shall share the burden. Behold, Edith, the chamber of Nirinel." Swiftly the gate opened, and suddenly the darkness was banished. Fixed to the vast encircling walls 100 torches burned, casting their splendour over the richly carved rock where all manner of creatures were depicted. Edie curtsied to the silent stone audience, craning her head back to see just how high the carvings reached up the walls. It was then that she saw it. Rising from the bare earthen floor and rearing in a massive arc into the dark heights above was the trunk of a gigantic tree. Gnarled, knotted bulges protruded from the blighted, blackened bark. "What killed it?" Edie asked bluntly. Miss Ursula put her arm about the girl's shoulders. "Nirnal is not dead," she said softly. "A trickle of sap still oozes deep within its being, and while it does, there is hope." Edie began to dance with joy. "The tree's alive," her high voice rang within the cavern. "Again, I must correct you," Miss Ursula told her. "This is no tree. It is but the last remaining root of the legendary world tree, Yggdrasil, which flourished in the dawn of time." The child ceased her dancing and stared up at the immense rearing shadow. "Come, Edith, I will explain." Where the massive root thrust up out of the ground, a circular dais of stone jutted from the floor. Upon this, the elderly woman sat and patted the space at her side for the girl to join her. "I shall not begin at the beginning of things," Miss Ursula said, "for that time was filled with darkness. My tale commences when Yggdrasil first bloomed and the early rays of the new sun smiled upon its leaves. In that glorious dawn, the world tree was the fairest and most wondrous sight that ever was. Its 3 main roots stretched about the globe. Like a living mountain it rose above the landscape, but it cast no despairing shade upon the ground below, for Yggdrasil's foliage shone with an emerald light, and in its cradling boughs the first ancestors of mankind were nurtured. The first civilization was named Asgar, and in that early time there was no sickness or death." "Was you there then?" Edie asked. The elderly woman smiled gravely. "Yes," she murmured. "My sisters and I were born in that sylvan shade. Yet there were other beings who roamed the globe," she continued, shivering slightly. "Spirits of cold and darkness, drawn from the freezing waters when the world was formed, who clad themselves in chill flesh as giants terrible to behold. In a desolate, forsaken country, where none of the world tree's roots had delved, they dwelt. A great gulf separated their realm from the main continent." Miss Ursula paused to gaze up at the huge, decaying root. "You and I can only suspect the extent of their fury when the first light burst forth to herald Yggdrasil's unfurling," she said. "They had considered themselves to be lords of darkness." "What did they do?" "Sought for ways to destroy it," Miss Ursula told her. "For it was prophesied that as long as there was sap within the smallest leaf of the world tree, their previous lordship and tyranny would be denied them. So began the building of the ice bridge to span the great chasm." "Oh, Ursula!" cried a voice suddenly, and Edie turned to see Miss Celandine and Miss Veronica standing by the gate. Their gaze fixed upon the withered root, the 2 sisters shambled inside. "It's been so long since you let us come down here," Miss Celandine declared reproachfully. "You are a meanie, Ursula. You know how I adored Nirrinel so. Why, look how shriveled it has become. We must anoint it with the water like we used to, and make it hale again." Clambering up beside them, she pulled away a great swathe of mouldering growth, and in the centre of the dais uncovered a deep hole. Miss Celandine cast handfuls of the dead lichen down into the darkness, listening for the resulting splashes. But no sound rose into the cavern, and a look of comprehension slowly settled over the woman's wrinkled face. "I had forgotten," she whispered. "The well is dry, isn't it?" Miss Ursula nodded. "The sacred spring dried up many, many years ago," she said wearily, as if repeating this information was an hourly ritual. "And every last drop of the blessed water was drained 50 years ago in order to vanquish Belial." She turned to Edie. "My poor sisters are wasting away in mind as well as body, Their lives and mine are bound closely to that of Niranel. As it fades, so, too, do we." Edie eyed her shrewdly. "And mine?" she demanded. "The young will not perish as swiftly as the aged," came the unhelpful reply. "I do not foresee what is to come, for the loom is damaged, and the web was never completed. But I believe you shall be our salvation. Now, let us return to the museum." Edie jumped from the dais and took hold of Miss Ursula's proffered hand. But the woman's palm was cold and clammy. The girl could not help but wonder why. Night crawled by, and the museum settled into the heavy shadows that its forbidding bulk created. Outside the museum, swathed beneath a midnight robe, his face lost under a heavy cowl, a stranger stared up at the blank windows. The figure raised its arms, and in the freezing air the arthritic fingers drew a curious sign. "Hearken to me, my faithful ones. Your master has arisen from his cold, cursed sleep. I charge you by your ancient names, thought and memory. Let dead flesh pulse to obey my bidding once more." Up into the shivering ether the strident spell soared, until the words penetrated the windows of the Wyrd Museum and were heard in the separate collection. Amongst the splintered display cabinets, the mighty chant flowed, summoning and rousing, invoking and commanding, until a black, wasted shape writhed with new life. Fractured bones fused together, and hot blood began pumping through branching veins. Within the sunken depths of two rotted sockets, a pair of black eyes bulged into place. The bird which cast its malevolent gaze about the shadows was a stark portrait of misshapen ugliness. Coal-black was the vicious beak which speared out from a sleek, flat head, and powerful were its tensed shoulders. Leaping across the wreckage, the raven darted from shadow to shadow, tearing aside the obstacles in its path, until finally it found what it was seeking: the moth-eaten body of a second raven. The reanimated bird stared sorrowfully down at the crumpled corpse, and the sharp, guileful gleam faded in its eyes. The bird drew back, but checked its staggering steps. Curious eyes were regarding it intently. Its beak opened to give an outraged hiss when it saw a young human child, and it leapt into the air. Edie Dorkins watched in mild amusement as the bird dived straight for her like an arrow from a bow. But the pleasure quickly vanished from her upturned face when she saw the outstretched talons. The girl whisked about and fled from the room. Through one room after another Edie ran, but the raven was always there. Breathlessly she burst onto the landing and began tearing up the stairs, but the evil bird lunged for her, viciously seizing hold of her exposed neck. One of its claws caught in the stitches of the pixie hood, and the flecks of silver tinsel began to shine, becoming a mesh of blinding light. Furiously, the creature wrenched and tugged at its foot, for the wool burned and blistered. But it could not break free of those stitches, for the fates themselves had woven them. In a last despairing attempt, the raven closed its beak about its own flesh and snapped it shut. There was a rending and crunching of bone, then warm blood spurted onto Edie's neck. The bird recoiled, seething with impotent wrath before flying back into the separate collection. Through one of the windows, the raven exploded, cannoning out into the cold night. "Thought," a frail voice invaded its mind. "To me." The raven immediately began to spiral down, its gleaming eyes fixed upon the hooded figure. "Come, my old friend," the stranger uttered. "Too many ages have passed since you flew before me in battle." Wincing from the pain of its mutilated claw, the raven alighted upon a cloaked shoulder and bobbed its head to greet its ancient master. "Now do I begin to feel whole again," the figure sighed. The bird croaked softly and brushed its feathery body against the shrouded head. "I ought to remonstrate with you for not fleeing that accursed place sooner," the voice chided gently. "You were rash to assail that child, for she has the protection of the royal house. But where is your brother?" In a hideous, croaking parody of a human voice, the raven spoke. "Alas for mine brother! His dead bones lie yonder still,
unable to hear thy summons. The weight of years did ravage him sorely.
Its master lifted a wizened hand and caressed the bird tenderly.
It is to be expected, he murmured sorrowfully. Lift your eyes, my slave, and look about you. You have been embraced by death many thousands of years. In truth, the bird muttered, is it indeed so long? Then the battle was lost, and the three victorious. Can you remember nothing of those final moments?
Thought closed its eyes.
I can see the field of combat. The air rings with the music of steel. The 12 are with us, and no one can withstand their fury. But wait! Memory, my brother, hath hastened toward the wood before the appointed time. To the very edge of that forest I storm, till the mist rises, and it is too late. I see but briefly the daughters of the royal house of Ascar standing beneath the great root, and then there is darkness. Locked in their custody you have been for all this time, the cloaked figure concluded. Yes, the battle was lost, and even the 12 were routed. I, too, was defeated, but the war continues, for I have arisen. Though I am weak and ailing, so too are they. The enchanted wood is no more, the stags are departed, and the well is dry. Thought cocked its head to one side as its master continued. There is a chance, but we must be careful. Although the mists no longer shroud the attendants of Nirenel, they have amassed a great store of artifacts within that shrine of theirs, which now protects them. If we are to succeed, we must draw the loom maidens out. Yet the greatest prize lies without their walls, a marvel possessed of such power that it could bring about their ruin. Crowing delightedly, the raven jumped into the air. How is it the witches of the well have blundered so? Oh, they are aware of its existence, came the assured reply. Ordor fears it, as do I. Thou art afraid of this treasure? Thought cawed in astonishment. Much has transpired since you passed into oblivion, the figure said darkly. The prize I seek is hidden and cannot be won, save by one who has drunk of the sacred water. I must endeavor to compel one of the three sisters to deliver it to me, and in this you are to play an important role. Many leagues from here, where this mighty thing is bestowed, the trap is already set, and into it I have poured my failing enchantments. The raven landed back upon the shoulder and stared into the darkness beneath the hood. Yes, the unseen lips answered. I have labored long to call back my deadliest of servants. Daily their numbers increase, and soon they will be 12 again. You will lead them, the figure instructed. I must remain here to gather strength for the final days. Yet you shall not go alone. The figure took a last despising look at the museum before turning to shamble back along Well Lane. Come, he said. There is one nearby who will have to be deceived into our service. When the treasure is found, it is he who must wield it. Soon the webs of destiny will be destroyed forever, and the shrine of Nirenel a smoking ruin. With the raven cackling wickedly upon his shoulder, the cloaked stranger melted into the shadows. A leaden sky and drenching drizzle heralded the first day of term after the Christmas break, and by the time they had splashed to school, the pupils of the local comprehensive were a damp and straggly rabble. Waiting at reception, Neil watched them barge by. Without looking up at him, the school secretary said, "You're in Mr. Battersby's form. They won't be there now, though. There's an assembly this morning in the drama centre across the playground." Neil hurried from the main doors over a tarmac square to where a low building stood and hastened inside.
Fortunately, the assembly had not yet begun, and he slipped in amongst the children, still finding their seats. Suddenly, the chatter died down as the head teacher strode into the room. "Good morning," Mrs. Stride said, briskly rubbing her hands together. The children mumbled their replies. "Now, you all know Reverend Galloway?" She stood aside as a man in vestments rose from his seat, and a groan issued about the theatre. The Reverend Peter Galloway was a young man with auburn hair, whose soul brimmed with the joy of his beliefs. "I hope you all enjoyed Christmas," he said. The children eyed him warily. "Let us not forget," he continued, "that Christmas is not merely a time for exchanging gifts. At that season, the Saviour of mankind was born. Can you imagine the wonder that the people felt at the time of the Nativity? Think of the shepherds who fell on their faces in terror when the angel appeared, revealed in glory." At Neil's side, a boy muttered in a loud whisper, "I'd be scared too if a man in a white dress revealed his glory." The children burst into fits of laughter. Peter Galloway waited for the mirth to die down. "But that's precisely my point," he exclaimed to everyone's surprise. "If we are to get anywhere, you have to dismiss the silly image of an angel with wings and a halo. Picture the stony landscape outside Bethlehem. The shepherds are used to the brutalities and hardships of Roman rule. Only something truly terrifying could possibly frighten them. Was it merely a fierce bright light, or did the angel have a more tangible, unhuman form?" His audience was paying attention. "These events really happened. This man with the strange, radical ideas actually lived, and when he was only 33, he was executed because he had dared to think them." The vicar drew himself up. "Do any of you know what it means to be crucified?" he asked. The pupils nodded, but the Reverend Galloway shook his head. "Oh, you've seen all the pictures of him, with his arms outstretched upon the cross, with nails in his hands and feet. The truth was far bloodier than that." "Cool," said Neil's neighbour. "Through the wrists the nails were hammered, and if you were lucky, it'd sever the arteries and you'd bleed to death. But if you weren't, then the feet would be skewered to the cross, with the nails driven through the heels." For the first time, the vicar knew that the children were listening to him. "When the hammering was over," Peter Galloway resumed, "the cross was hoisted upright. Hanging there, with your head slumped on your chest, the only way to draw a proper breath would be to push yourself up by the nails impaling your heels. But to stop the prisoners doing this, the Roman guards went round to each one and savagely broke their legs. That is what happened to the man born in Bethlehem. Although the agony and the suffering was excruciating, somehow he managed to cling to life. However, the following day was the Sabbath, and no one was permitted to be on the cross during that time. Having survived all this torment and pain, our Lord was finally killed by a Roman spear thrust viciously into his side." The head teacher had never known the theatre to be so full and yet so silent. Taking a step towards the Reverend Galloway, she hoped to lead the outrageous man from the stage. But he was not done. "Yes," he cried, reveling in the experience of holding their attention. "He was tortured for the sins of the world, and because of his ultimate sacrifice, we can all find forgiveness and know true happiness." Trembling with excitement, the Reverend ran to the edge of the stage where he had placed a tape recorder. "This is what it's like to feel that joy," he enthused. "The Lord lives in me and in all of you if you'll let him. He is the light of the world, the Lord of the dance." With that, he punched the button down, and the tune to that hymn began to blare from the speakers. In one practice movement, Peter ripped open his cassock to reveal a full-length black leotard and began to leap about the stage. For a whole minute, both the children and the members of staff could only gape at the zealous young man. Then, in one great united voice, the entire theatre erupted with a terrific peal of laughter. Totally unprepared for this reaction, Peter's steps faltered, and he stared about him. His hopes and spirits crushed, he walked over to the tape recorder and turned it off. Then, retrieving his cassock, The Reverend Galloway left the theatre with the laughter still resounding in his ears and branded upon his heart. "All right," Mrs. Stride called. "The fun's over. We'll have the Lord's Prayer." So Neil's first day at his new school commenced. But when the assembly was over and he trailed off to his first lesson, he found himself longing for the excitement of the Wyrd Museum. Already he missed the dark, shadowy corners of its lonely galleries. Sitting in a worn leather armchair, with her cane resting upon her lap, Miss Veronica watched the rain streak down the diamond-latticed panes.
"You're no fun today, Veronica,"
whined Celandine.
"Let her be, Celandine,"
Miss Ursula interrupted.
"If Veronica wishes to be childish, do not spoil it for her."
The Websters' quarters were situated at the top of the Wyrd Museum. Cluttered with bric-a-brac collected over the endless years, it was a monument to the building's history. For Edie, the place was a treasury of enchantment. Lifting her gaze to the mantelpiece, she stared at the vases which stood upon either side. Never had she seen anything like the peacock feathers which those vessels contained.
"I never seen a bird with feathers like this," she muttered. "Much nicer than that big black un last night. Well, the biggest crow I ever saw. Bold he were, too. Chased me clean through the rooms downstairs."
Hoisting the hem of her skirt, she showed the others the raven's claw marks.
"A large crow," Miss Ursula repeated. "Are you certain, Edith?"
The girl fished in the pocket of her coat, pulled out the talon that the creature had left behind, and flourished it proudly.
"There,"
she declared. Miss Ursula's expression changed from disbelief to dismay.
"Did I do wrong?"
Edie asked. For a minute no one answered her. Then a sorrowful voice said,
"I know. The talon belongs to a raven."
Miss Veronica struggled to remember more.
"But weren't there two of them?"
Miss Ursula glared at Edie.
"Have you told me the truth, child?"
she demanded. Edie nodded resolutely, and Miss Ursula drew a horrified breath.
"It is too soon. We are not ready."
Casting a glance at the confused figure in the armchair, the eldest of the Websters whirled about and hurried from the room.
"Why is Ursula so scared?"
Edie asked.
"There were two ravens,"
Miss Veronica said, as she struggled to recall the fleeting memories.
"Two of them, and they belonged to someone very special. What were their names?" "You are shameless," Miss Celandine berated Edie. "Poor Veronica mustn't remember."
The girl eyed her mutinously. Perhaps if she asked about something else, she could catch her off guard.
"Tell me what happened to the land of Asgard,"
she piped up unexpectedly. At the mention of that name, Miss Celandine brightened.
"Oh, it was so heavenly," she began. "The gentlemen were tall and dashing. Oh, what dances we had!"
"What about the giants?" Edie urged. Miss Celandine's grin disappeared.
"When those terrible ice lords first stepped upon the shores of the fertile lands, they saw in the distance the wondrous light of the World Tree. They quarrelled about what to do until their leader was so disgusted that he stormed off on his own. Over the pretty hillsides he rampaged, drawing ever closer to Yggdrasil, and when at last he reached the lowest and most outlying of boughs, he leapt up and swung his great axe."
Miss Celandine let the tragedy of those words imprint themselves upon the intrigued child.
"Hacked it clear through, that monster did," she uttered sadly. "A horrendous shiver travelled through the great ash, from its topmost leaves to the bottommost root, and suddenly we were all afraid."
"Is that when the tree died?" Edie asked breathlessly. Miss Celandine ran her fingers through the ragged lace that fringed her gown.
"No," she said simply. "Only the bough was hewn. The ogre could do no more damage, for the massive branch toppled right down on top of him and broke his frozen head to bits. 3 days it took for the people of the city to ride about the trunk to where the sap seeped from that hideous gash."
"Then how did Yggdrasil die?" Edie pressed.
"It was the other giants," Miss Celandine cried. "They saw what happened to their leader and knew that weapons more cunning than axes would have to be used. They drew weak people into their service until eventually they discovered the whereabouts of 2 of the World Tree's roots. Oh, it was terrible. Into them they fed the bitterest poisons. How we cried when a second shudder quaked the earth and Yggdrasil sickened. But no one, not even the enemy's watchful spies, knew where the third and final route could be found.
Resting her chin in her hands, Edie closed her eyes and recalled the impressive sight of the withered Nirranil far below the museum.
But they did in the end,
she muttered glumly. Miss Celandine stroked her head.
Don't be silly, she said. The end hasn't happened yet. The sun still shines. Tell me what happened next, Edie asked. Great expanses of the world tree started to rot, the elderly woman murmured sadly. In those decaying wounds, sicknesses and plagues were spawned. Many fell ill and perished. But something wonderful happened. When the first bough was hacked from the ash, she said, no one knew what to do with it. The wood was that of the world tree, and no one could imagine what powers it might possess. Then our mother, who was Asgar's queen, had a vision in which she saw what had to be done.
Edie gazed at the old woman.
Then you're a princess, she laughed. I was, Miss Celandine answered mournfully. A long time ago, when my name was different. Celandine, Edie said firmly. What did the vision tell your mother to make out of the fallen branch? Why, the loom, of course, she declared. The loom of destiny, where we weave the fortunes of mankind. Veronica would measure the threads, I would spin them, and Ursula would cut them. The whole world was caught in our tapestry. No one escaped us.
Edie's skin prickled with excitement.
Of course, Miss Celandine added. At first nobody dared to string it, and so the very first day it was completed, the loom was left in the courtyard. What happened then? At the dead of night, Miss Celandine said, Ursula looked out of her window and saw 4 milk-white stags come boldly into the court and carry the loom away upon their silver antlers. Of course, she raised the alarm at once, but they had vanished. It was Ursula's fault, Miss Veronica's voice piped up. Drawing near to the armchair, Edie brought her face close to the heavily painted eyes. It was years later, Miss Veronica continued, on a night of calm. Ursula was roaming under that part of the tree which was still untouched by poison when, in the rustling of the leaves, she heard a whispering voice. "Stop her, someone!" Miss Celandine squeaked. "I didn't make her remember!" With a start, Miss Veronica gripped her walking cane. "The ravens!" she cried abruptly. "Thought and memory! That's what they were called!"
Along the stretch of main road which cuts across the lower slopes of Glastonbury Tor, a plump figure with carrot-coloured hair strained at the pedals of her bicycle. Only the hedgerow separated her from the strangely shaped hill. The Tor, with the solitary tower dedicated to St. Michael spiking up from its summit, was a stately sight. Nowhere else was quite like this small town. It was a special, haunting place, and the powerful vision of the Tor presided over all. Lauren Humphreys had only lived there for 4 months. As she sailed by the high banks of the reservoir, she saw a group of boys larking about at the roadside. Their voices were jeering with laughter. "Barmy Tommy!" they cried. Surrounded by the group of 12-year-olds, an old man known locally as Tommy laughed good-naturedly. "Do us your teapot, Tommy! What do dogs do, Tommy?" The white-haired old man crooked one arm in compliance and waggled from side to side, pouring imaginary tea from the pretend spout of his hand as he yapped like a terrier. "Give us your hat, Tommy," one of them called, reaching across and grabbing the battered cloth cap from his head. "Hey!" Lauren's angry voice interrupted the cruel game. "Leave him alone!" Propping her bicycle against the hedge, she pulled the boys away. Grudgingly they walked off, singing out a string of insults. The girl ignored them and looked around to see if the old man was all right. "Did those lads frighten you?" she asked him. The old man stared at her. "We was only playing a game. They wouldn't want to scare old Tommy." Exasperated, Lauren turned to stare at him. Fine silver stubble bristled along his chin, and although he had never been seen without a smile, there was an element of sadness about his eyes. Under his shabby overcoat, he wore a jumper that had been darned umpteen times. Lauren had seen him about the town on numerous occasions, but had never spoken to him before now. "Dusk's coming," Tommy uttered apprehensively. "Time to be indoors. The dark's no place to be outside no more. Not round here it ain't." Lauren found herself asking why. "'Tain't safe," the old man answered. "You not heard about the women folk falling sick and lying tired and drained in their beds during the day? Strange things is riding under the stars. Tommy heard 'em." With that, he pushed through a gap in the hedge to trundle away over the field beyond. Painted a pleasant chalky blue, the Humphreys' house was surrounded on three sides by a sprawling field. The tires of Lauren's bicycle crunched on the gravel as she entered the front gate. "Poor old nutter," she thought to herself, dismounting and propping her bicycle beside the back door. "Hello, Lauren," a woman's voice said as she opened the door, and the girl's heart sank. "How was your day?" Lauren managed a polite grin and hung her coat upon the rack, whilst her future stepmother regarded her from the kitchen table. "Come sit with me for a minute. We hardly ever get a chance to talk." Inwardly groaning, Lauren poured herself a glass of orange and sat down. Sheila was a pleasant-looking woman in her late 30s, and the girl understood that Guy, her father, needed to have someone other than herself in his life. Yet the very first time Lauren met Sheila, she knew she could never warm to this meticulous, slightly bossy person. "Sheila," she began, "what do you know about Tommy?" The woman sniffed. "Do you mean that funny old tramp? I always walk on the opposite side of the road if I see him." "Where does he live?" "How should I know? In some hostel, I suppose." Sheila's attention was given over to a package lying upon the table. "Now, what do you think of this, Laurie? I bought it in one of those crystal shops on the high street." From blue wrappings printed with silver stars and circles, she brought out the most outlandish doll that Lauren had ever seen. It was half crow, half woman. A tiny straw hat sat upon its black, bird-like head, and two shiny beads were sewn either side of a long yellow beak. Poking from the sleeves of a gingham dress to form spiky hands was an assortment of twigs. Around the doll's stomach there was a calico apron on which was embroidered the word, "Look." "The woman in the shop called it a crow doll," Sheila said, not minding the girl's obvious aversion to it. "It's creepy. What does "Halurk" mean?" "I didn't ask. It's stuffed full of herbs. That woman said it would help my insomnia. She told me to hang it above the bed." Lauren grimaced. "I never liked crows." Sheila arched her eyebrows. Guy's daughter could be most odd at times. "Blood and sand," Brian Chapman grunted as he thrust the saw blade through a slender branch. Perched upon a stepladder, the caretaker of the Wyrd Museum could not believe what he was doing. Already the floor of the separate collection was covered in fallen twigs and leaves, and he was having serious difficulty in coming to terms with it all. Suddenly, into the separate collection came Miss Ursula Webster. She hastened to the far end of the room, where he had stowed the exhibits, and began to hunt through every box. "He cannot have returned so soon," she attempted to reassure herself. "We are not ready. The child is not prepared. Have I endured these endless years only to be confounded at the last?" Suddenly she gave a great glad shout as, from a large chest, she pulled a black, scraggy bundle. Here was the stuffed remains of the second raven. "There now, memory," she whispered, giving the beak a scornful tap. "In life you were a vicious imp, enslaved to a deceitful master. I find you much more pleasing shriveled like this. And yet," she muttered, "where is your brother?" Clasping the stuffed bird to her breast, she whirled about and stared up at Brian Chapman. "What happened to the other raven?" she demanded. Neil's father gave a nervous cough. "I'm sorry, Miss Webster. There was only one," he replied. "Then Edith was right," she breathed in a mortified whisper. "Thought has indeed escaped from the museum. His master has returned to assail us once more." She let the stuffed raven fall from her grasp. "What am I to do? The enemy of old walks this land once more. Her cryptic words echoed about the panelled room, and it seemed to Brian that the lights became dim.
"One of the captain's messengers has been called back from death," Miss Ursula continued. "Why he has failed to rekindle memory, I do not know. I can only hazard that his powers are not as strong as he believed them to be. Either that or—"
When Miss Ursula next spoke, her voice was filled with dread.
"Or he has spent it elsewhere. Has he exhausted himself to bring his other, more deadly servants back into the world? If so, then our peril is even greater. The device which I refused to shelter long ago must be brought here straight away."
She strode purposefully towards the doorway.
"Thought and memory,"
Miss Veronica declared when Miss Ursula returned to the Websters' apartment.
"Is that all you remember of them, Veronica?"
Miss Ursula asked softly. The figure in the armchair gave a wistful sigh.
"Both gone now," she murmured. "No more sweet messages."
Miss Celandine sat bolt upright.
"It wasn't me, Ursula,"
she denied vehemently.
"The girl made Veronica remember."
Miss Ursula turned to look at Edie.
"The hour has come when perhaps we must remember," she said. "Last night, Thought's mortal remains were indeed renewed." "Come, Edith," Miss Ursula said, taking the child's hand and sitting her down. "Your first labour has come sooner than expected."
The child grinned. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. Fingering the jet beads about her throat, Miss Ursula stared keenly at her.
"Many years ago," she explained, "a most perilous device was interred far from here for safety's sake. It was a mighty magical thing, far too dangerous to keep within the confines of my museum."
The old woman passed a hand over her eyes.
"Edith, you must venture out to fetch this thing. Celandine, Veronica, myself, we are bound to the museum. It is Nirenel from which we draw our strength. But do not worry, a guide will accompany you upon the journey."
"Who?" Edie asked.
"There are still in this world some of the old race. At the commencement of every year they congregate in the yard below to pay a tribute of flowers, decorating the fountain in memory of what was. Amongst those folk there is one man in whom the blood of Asgar runs almost pure. It is he who will go with you, Edith. And now, sisters, we must summon him."
Edie watched in fascination as Miss Veronica lifted her walking cane.
"Reach out, Edith," Miss Ursula told her gravely. "Touch it lightly with your fingertips."
The girl complied, her dirty hands looking tiny next to Miss Celandine's clumsy spades, and as black as coal compared to Miss Ursula's pale, violet-veined skin. Miss Veronica drew a deep breath and lifted her face to the ceiling.
"Let the measure find the one we seek and take us to him," she whispered.
Then Miss Ursula began to chant,
"Aidan, Aidan, Aidan."
Edie gasped, for the tips of her fingers were tingling, and stared down at the walking cane. The black rod was glimmering. A faint green radiance was coursing through the grain. Swiftly the light welled up, shining into the four intent faces.
"Aidan,"
Miss Ursula repeated. Above them the ceiling melted away to reveal an open sky that was growing dark with the approaching evening. Edie saw a hilly landscape unfurl all around them. To her complete delight, she realized that she and the Websters were no longer within the Wyrd Museum. At the edge of a wood, 3 miles from Glastonbury, 2 vehicles were parked upon a grassy verge. The largest, a barely roadworthy coach, was painted with a multitude of flowers and rainbows. Directly behind it was a pale blue van. Around a small campfire, a group of travellers discussed the day's events. Usually, 3 men and 2 women sat about the fire, but that night a 4th man had joined them. A mysterious figure who never stopped in one place for any length of time. Their friend and mentor was known to them simply as Aidan. Dressed in a coat of chocolate-coloured velvet, his long, dark hair trailed past his shoulders, and his green eyes gleamed with cunning and wisdom. Everyone who spent any amount of time in his society respected and admired him. "So where have you been since we saw you last?" queried one of the women, filling mugs with elderflower wine. Luke, her husband, passed the brimming vessels around. Aidan placed his drink in the space between his crossed legs. "I have been hither and yon, and tomorrow I shall be elsewhere. But for tonight I am here, and that is good fortune enough for me." "What about a story?" asked one who had not yet spoken. "Go on, Aidan. No, a tune." Aidan brought out a beautiful silver flute. "Play one of your own melodies," Owen asked. "They always cheer me up." Aidan saw the strain revealed upon the man's face. Then he gazed around at each of the other travellers. Resting the flute across his knees, he said, "Which of you will tell me what is going on?" Rhonda fidgeted. "Difficult to know where to start," her husband put in. "A little while before that car wreck," Owen said. "That's when it was." Aidan leaned forward. "I heard about that. The car was ripped open, was it not? What else do you know?" "Nothing we can explain," Rhonda admitted. Luke shook his head. "Plus, there's this weird sickness going around. I don't want Ron to catch it." "Nor Dot," agreed Patrick. Aidan's forehead furrowed. "Are you saying it affects only the women folk?" Rhonda nodded. "About 10 of them, last I heard," she said. "Too exhausted to do anything but stay in bed all day." Owen scratched their Jack Russell's ear. "For the past few nights I've been aware of evil, I suppose. Well, what do you think?" Aidan gave him a solemn smile. "I should get out of here as fast as you possibly can. The environs of Glastonbury have become a most dangerous and deadly place." With that, he lifted the flute to his lips. The travellers looked at each other in consternation, disturbed by their old friend's words. But as the delicious, meandering refrain played over them, the melody entered their hearts and minds, banishing their anxiety. A moment later, Owen let out a shout. Sitting before him, taking the places of Rhonda, Luke, Dot and Patrick, yet arrayed in the travellers' clothes, were 3 old women and a young girl. Immediately, Aidan leapt to his feet and bowed low. He knew at once the identities of these 3 elderly ladies and had yearned for this moment throughout his entire life. "Aidan!" Owen cried, shattering the wondrous moment. "Who are they? Where are the others?" "Calm yourself," Aidan managed to say. "But they've snatched the bodies." Incongruously dressed in Rhonda's sweater and jeans, Miss Ursula Webster paid Owen no heed. Swamped by Dot's orange caftan, Edie Dorkins chuckled at the sight of Aidan's awestruck face. "You are most welcome here," Aidan stuttered. "This is the highest possible honour." "Enough," Miss Ursula said tersely. "It is gratifying that you know who we are. Yes, there is much of Asgard in you. Listen closely to me, Aidan. There is a task I wish you to perform." "Name it." "First, you must come to the museum. There you will learn all you need to know concerning the high office which dire necessity compels me to command you to undertake." I will leave at once." Then, as suddenly as they arrived, the Websters and Edie disappeared, their unlikely figures replaced by those of his friends. "Owen!" Rhonda laughed. "What's the matter? You look as if you've seen a ghost. Aidan, that was lovely." Aidan gave Owen a reassuring look. "I've got to go," he announced with tremendous urgency. "Aidan," Luke protested. "You can't. Ron's going to make one of our famous stews." Owen grabbed his friend's arm. "Let him go," he said in a quavering voice. "Believe me, he's got more important things to do." In the Websters' apartments, Edie was mildly shocked to find that it was still raining. "I like that," she told Miss Ursula. The old woman rose from the chair and smoothed out the creases in her evening gown.
As soon as Aidan arrives tonight, she instructed, you are to go with him, Edith. Come, she insisted, heading for the doorway. Let us descend to the chamber of Nirinel, and there I shall tell you all you must know. Ursula? Everyone jerked their heads around to see Miss Veronica raise her shriveled arm to point the cane at her sister in accusation as the confusion which had clouded her mind for so long cleared. I remember now, she stormed. Who was it told my captain how to attain godhead? You were always jealous of what we had together. That I knew, but I never suspected the depths to which you would stoop to steal him from me. Veronica, Miss Ursula commanded, but her sister would not be silenced. It was your words which pinned him to the tree, as surely as the nails that were driven through his flesh, she snapped. 9 nights he hung there, in which I sought for him, and nearly perished in the wild. Oh, I found him in the end, but too late. When the sun dawned upon that 10th day, he was no longer mortal. Ursula, with every breath I curse your spiteful soul. Aghast at the ferocity of Miss Veronica's attack, Edie looked up at Miss Ursula. It was plain that the old woman was horribly distressed. You are wrong, Veronica, she cried. It was the only way. He was the only one suitable. Do you honestly believe it was my decision? You forget the dire peril our people were facing. His valor bought our escape. Escape? Miss Veronica raged, striking the armchair fiercely. Better to have met death than go running to this wretched jail where we've rotted ever since. Her sister recoiled, staggering to the doorway. Come, Edith, she said huskily. There is much you must learn. Go, Miss Veronica breathed, leaning heavily upon the cane as she listened to their footsteps descend the staircase. Bring the magical device to this accursed place. It won't avail you. This time, the gallows god will be victorious. Night crept over the Wyrd Museum. Into the separate collection, Miss Veronica hobbled, her eyes blinking in the gloom. Haltingly, she crossed to the far side where the crates and boxes stood and tenderly lifted out the remains of the stuffed raven. She held the long-dead creature to her bosom, and a great, uncontrollable sob surged up into her throat as the cold, bleak knowledge of who she was returned to torment her. Down her face the tears streamed. Verdandi of the royal house, she sobbed. Why did you hearken to the words of your sister? Why did you let her take him from you? The bird in her grasp was awash with her sorrow, its beak filling with salty tears. As Miss Veronica wept, a black shape flew across the one unboarded window and alighted upon the sill outside. Silhouetted against the window was perched another raven. Only this one was very much alive. It pecked fiercely upon the glass. Thought! The old woman exclaimed in wonderment. Unfurling his shadowy wings, Thought took to the air and beat upon the glass with them, before whirling suddenly to one side, where its claws raked upon one of the wooden boards covering a broken pane. Miss Veronica understood, and using the handle of her cane as a lever, she started to prise the board free. With a loud clatter, the wood fell to the floor, and into the separate collection the raven flew. "Dear friend," Miss Veronica called, as the bird settled upon a table. "You live! You are back amongst us!" The creature nodded its head in reverence.
"Hail to thee, Verdandi, youngest of the 3 princesses!"
His dry voice cawed.
"Long years have passed since the fair day when thou didst entrust unto my master the 2 orphaned chicks thou hadst found upon the borders of thy mother's realm." "I remember," she laughed. "He nursed you with his own hands and loved you both so dearly, but that was so long ago. See how I have aged. I am as old as the stones and more frail than a moth's wing. Yet the inferno of thy spirit blazes still, O keeper of my master's heart."
Miss Veronica gave a meek laugh. "You are wrong, Thought," she said. "I lost any claim to him when he listened to my sister's words and nailed himself upon the world tree.
If any blame can be placed upon my lord, then scold his valiant desire to save the realm,"
the raven squawked. Leaning upon the cane, the old woman gave a sad smile. "What does it matter now?" she murmured. "From Yggdrasil he attained godhead, and that was an end to my dreams ever after."
"One last message hath my master instructed me to deliver unto you,"
the raven crowed. "Why do you torment me?" Miss Veronica whimpered.
"A final message,"
the bird insisted, and he recited what he had been commanded to relay.
"Princess, all quarrels must finally end. I would crave your forgiveness, but your sweet pardon is more than I hoped to expect. Permit me then to look upon you one last time."
Miss Veronica looked as if she might faint.
"The captain wishes to see me?" "Verily," Thought answered. "Even now he awaits thee."
"Where?" she gasped, breathless with excitement.
"Hast thou forgotten the trysting place of thy youth?"
A withered hand covered the pale, powdered face as Miss Veronica remembered the landscape of her secret rendezvous, with its majestic tor dominating the sapphire blue sky. "Innis Witrin!" she cried. "Does it still mean so much to him?"
"No place doth my master hold so dear,"
Thought told her.
"At sunset tomorrow,"
he squawked encouragingly,
"my lord will be waiting for thee."
"Have no fear," Miss Veronica whispered. "I shall go to him." A sly gleam flashed in the bird's eyes, and it spread its wings to take to the air.
"Then, until the morrow's ending,"
he cried. He wheeled around in a wide circle before bursting through the shattered window again. The main hallway of the Wyrd Museum was swamped in darkness. Down the stairs Miss Veronica came. Over her white, diaphanous robe, the old woman had pulled on a heavy overcoat, and stuffed into one of its pockets the tip of a crumpled envelope could plainly be seen. It was addressed to Brian Chapman, and inside it contained the caretaker's wages. At last her slippered feet gained the parquet floor, and she moved stealthily towards the main entrance.
"Oi!"
cried a voice suddenly. Miss Veronica twisted about.
"Where do you think you're off to?"
Edie Dorkins demanded. "Don't tell Ursula," Miss Veronica begged. "Please, Edith, let Verdandi live again, just for a short while." Edie rocked on her heels as she considered the situation.
"I'll let you go,"
she said, enjoying the power she held over the old woman,
"if you take me with you."
"I cannot," Miss Veronica murmured. "I promised I would meet my captain. He asked for no one to accompany me."
"Then I'll just go shout down to Ursula,"
Edie threatened. "No!" the old woman cried. You may join me, you willful child, but we must go at once." Edie let out a high, gleeful laugh. Miss Veronica placed her crippled hands upon the door handle and, with her heart in her mouth, gave it a twist. The great arch door swung inward, and for the first time in many ages, Miss Veronica crossed the threshold of the Wyrd Museum. For a moment, she stood on the topmost step, framed by the bronze statues which adorned the imposing Victorian entrance. A droplet of water splashed upon her head, and she glanced upwards. There, surmounting the sign which bore the building's name, the severe-looking sculpted figure above the arch was weeping. "Ursula!" Miss Veronica cried. Edie nudged her crossly.
"It's only a bit of old rain dripping off the statue," she said.
Miss Veronica gazed at the sculpted form upon her right.
"Farewell, Celandine,"
she whispered. Slowly she moved away from the steps. Edie capered to Miss Veronica's side.
"Where are we going?"
"Even in my time it was known by many names, Edith," she said. "But I believe it became known in the later years as Glastonbury."
"Never heard of it."
Miss Veronica smiled simply. "It is far from here, and we must make haste if we are to reach it by sunset tomorrow. I think I once heard Ursula complain of great iron carriages which travel at thunderous speeds upon rails of steel. Come, Let us avail ourselves of this marvel." Transforming the wet roads into rivers of reflected amber jewels, the street lamps of Bethnal Green buzzed in the cold night, but the Reverend Peter Galloway neither saw nor heard them. He walked through the East End, his soul heavy with disappointment. Ever since that morning, when he had been laughed off the stage at the school's assembly, he had been forced to challenge his own ideas. All he had wanted to do was demonstrate how wonderful faith could be, yet he had only succeeded in making a complete spectacle of himself. It was past 2 o'clock when he neared his home. Peter decided to cut through the small park nearby. A wide pool flooded the pathway, stretching back as far as a small cenotaph. He gazed down at the perfect stillness of the water. The image was such a dishevelled sight that he hardly recognized himself, and jumped back. "Stay!" called a quiet voice. Peter whirled around and saw, standing by the white stone cross of the cenotaph, a robed figure whose features were hidden beneath the folds of a great hood. "Who's that?" the vicar demanded. A low chuckle sounded. "You have no reason to fear me, Cephas." Peter continued to watch the figure suspiciously. "What did you call me?" "The waters show but the outward aspect," the mellifluous voice resumed, letting the question go unanswered. "Only the heart can tell what lies within." The Reverend Galloway swept his hands through his bedraggled hair. "Look," he announced with mounting impatience, "I don't know who you are, but go play your daft games with someone else." Unperturbed, the figure raised one of its hands. "Peace," he said. "I know the pain which drives you. You look around and grieve for those who have spurned their Maker. The determination of your faith is like grains of gold shining in the muddy riverbed." The stranger moved into the center of the pond. "Do you still not know me?" he asked. The vicar made no reply, for he was staring at the water in sheer disbelief. Although he had just witnessed the mysterious stranger walk through it, not a ripple disturbed the surface. "Again, you see only the outward aspect," the voice told him. "What do you behold in the dark inner depths?" Peter stared down at the water, catching his breath when the pool shimmered and the image of the robed figure dissolved. The vision of a vast and mighty tree creaked and groaned as a storm raged about its branches. "What is this?" Peter breathed in awe. Then, his eyes widening in amazement, he beheld a man impaled upon the gargantuan trunk, with large iron nails hammered through his wrists. From his wounds, rivers of blood streamed down the bark. "Never have I known such torment," the robed stranger said. "But the sacrifice had to be made." The scene within the water faded with his words. "Now do you know me?" uttered the velvety voice. The Reverend's legs were shaking, and as they buckled beneath him, he finally mistakenly mouthed, "Dear Lord." Into the water he fell, landing with a great splash upon his knees, weeping like a child. "Tears," the figure intoned. "They are sobs of joy," Peter declared. "Then let them fall, and I shall tell you of my purpose here. The faith of the world has diminished and must be forged anew. It is up to you, Cephas, to deliver unto the doubters and skeptics the proof they require. In the sacred heart of this favoured land, where grows the holy thorn, lies buried a testimonial to the passion. Go seek out this thing, then display it to the world." "Me?" Peter gaped. "A companion shall I send with you," the figure said, "for guidance upon the road. Farewell, my Peter." Suddenly the stranger was gone. Gingerly Peter rose. His attention was abruptly seized by the sound of beating wings, and he looked up into the night to see a large bird. The creature swooped from the sky and touched down upon the path inches from Peter's sodden feet. "Thou must leave this night," Thought cried. A delighted chortle sounded from Peter's lips. "A talking crow!" The raven glowered, then rose from the ground and alighted upon Peter's shoulder.
Many leagues lie twixt us and our destination, he snapped.
I understand, Peter nodded. In the morning I can ask my sister if we can borrow her car.
Nyark!
Thought shrieked.
Upon this very instant our journey must begin. If thou hast not one of these wagons, then we must contrive a way to take one.
What? You mean steal?
What matter a borrowed trifle against the wealth of rejoicing that is to come?
The raven goaded. His judgment impaired by the momentous experience, Peter readily agreed.
Then cast thine eyes to where the highway drains into yonder road,
Thought told him. Peter looked across the park to where a car was pulling into a residential street. The driver must live in one of those flats, he muttered. The raven took to the air.
Get thee to that wagon as fast as thy spindle shanks allow,
he cawed. The maroon hatchback eased into the only remaining parking place, and its driver, a small, chubby man, squeezed himself out. Suddenly, from out of nowhere, a black-feathered mass crashed into his face, shrieking. The keys fell from his grasp. At once the raven plunged after them, snatching the tumbling prize in his beak, then rocketed upwards. "Hey!" the man cried. "Give me those!" Thought landed upon a railing just out of his reach and shook his head teasingly, making the keys jingle. The driver rushed forward to grab him, but the raven leapt away, drawing him further down the road. "Stay put, you cat's breakfast!" the man fumed. Emitting a shrill cry of glee, the raven tore back to the car where the Reverend Galloway was waiting. In disbelief, the driver whirled around to see the bird drop the keys in the vicar's hands. "Oi!" he bawled. "Stop! Police!" His heart pounding, the vicar threw himself inside. The raven flew into the car, screeching wildly. Peter thrust the key in the ignition, and the vehicle spluttered into life. With an apologetic wave to the true owner, Peter put his foot down, and the car shot from the parking space. The owner leapt back as his hatchback went tearing around the corner and disappeared behind the trees of the park. Peter Galloway stared out of the windscreen, sweat pouring off his face.
"Well done,"
the raven congratulated him.
"Be not aggrieved by this act, for it is the first step towards the great gladness that is to come."
"Yes," Peter murmured. "So, where exactly are we going?"
"To Innis Witrin, the blessed Isle of Avalon."
Reverend Galloway sighed with joy. "So it really is buried there. What better testament to the passion can there be?" Thought let the vicar avow his happiness. They were far from their destination, and there was still much to be done. In the small town of Glastonbury, the terrors which the raven's master had rekindled were to find their numbers increased by a new recruit. Lauren's stepmother twisted in sweat-soaked bedsheets, and the breaths which wheezed over her swollen tongue were shallow and laboured. "Guy," she uttered with a choking cough, "wake up! I think you'd better call the doctor." But nothing she could do would rouse him. Sheila's swimming eyes gradually focused upon the crow doll which hung upon the bedhead. Then she froze in horror. Beneath the small straw hat, the bird's bead eyes were staring down at her, and the twigs clattered together as it squirmed to unhook itself from the bedpost. "No!" the woman cried, leaping out of bed. She fled for the door, but the doll had worked itself free, and with supernatural force leapt onto the back of her head. Through her hair its fingers stretched, snaking about the woman's head and neck as it clung with vicious strength, and though she tried to tear it from her, there was no escape. Shrieking, Sheila collapsed against the door. In the adjoining room, Lauren was startled awake by her stepmother's cries. "Dad! Sheila!" she called, hurrying from her room. "What's going on?" Onto the landing she ran and pushed at the door, but it refused to budge. "Let me in!" she demanded. The frightened wails were subsiding now, but within the bedroom there came a series of frantic bumps and crashes. A low, hideous voice began to croak. "What's in there?" Lauren breathed in despair. Then there was silence. The girl gave the door a ferocious kick. The barrier shuddered open, and she tore inside. Upon the bed lay her father, yet she could see no sign of Sheila. Lauren crossed to where her father lay and shook him, yet the man merely snored in reply. Gooseflesh prickled over her arms. The window had been thrust open, and the net curtains were rippling with the breeze. Nervously, Lauren walked over and peered outside, fearing to see a broken body sprawled upon the gravel below. But no, the drive was empty. It was then that she discovered, gouged into the wooden sill, 4 deep claw marks. As she stepped nearer to examine them, something soft brushed against her toes. Lying upon the carpet was an immense jet-black feather.
Crouching on the floor, the girl picked it up and held it in the moonlight. Whatever creature this quill belonged to was like nothing she had ever seen, and her skin crawled even to touch it. Only the slumbering figure of her father prevented her from running to fetch help. If she waited until daylight, the situation might appear less unnatural. Lauren returned to her own room. There, with her knees tucked underneath her chin, she sat upon her bed and began to wait for the dawn. At the edge of the wood, where the traveller's brightly painted coach remained parked upon the verge, the two dogs who slept in a large box beneath the dilapidated coach started to whimper. Snug inside his sleeping bag, Owen grunted as the Labrador's whine became a frightened yowl. Rubbing his eyes, the man sat up. "Not again," he muttered, clambering out of the bag. Behind a draped curtain, a woman's voice asked in a drowsy whisper, "What's the matter with them?" Owen pulled on his jeans. "There's something awful out there, Ron. The poor brutes are scared witless." Owen pulled the door open. "Come on," he called. "Get in here." Yet the dogs refused to budge. Rhonda hugged herself. "We should have listened to Aidan and left," she said. High above, echoing across the sky, there came a horrible, frantic clamouring. "What on earth?" Rhonda whispered. "Birds? Doesn't sound like any flock I ever heard." "What is that racket?" called Luke. Rhonda turned to see her husband come through the curtain. Above the surrounding wood, the shrill screeching drew nearer. "I don't like it," Luke said, lunging for the driver's seat. "We've got to get out of here." "No!" Owen cried, dragging him back. "You'll draw attention to us." The wild, blaring shrieks reverberated above the trees. Patrick and Dot came blundering from their bunks and gazed at their friends with ashen faces. They heard the dogs yelp in terror, and through the windows saw them flee into the nearby wood. Then, abruptly, the roof buckled as a great weight came crashing on top of it, followed by another and another. Violently the vehicle shuddered as more of the unseen creatures landed upon it, their terrible croaking voices crowing and screeching. "Save us!" Rhonda prayed. The coach suddenly lurched beneath the impact of a tremendous blow. The travellers within were hurled against the side, floundering into the windows and tearing down the curtains in their battle for balance. "Let me out!" Dot hollered. Even as she tore the door open, strong hands gripped her. "Listen to me!" Owen shouted. "God knows what's up there, but you won't last 5 seconds if you—" His voice was suddenly lost, as through the open door a great repulsive talon came stretching. It drove deep into Owen's shoulder, puncturing the flesh and hooking deep inside his ribs. Struggling for all he was worth, the man was dragged outside. When his wide, tormented eyes glared upwards to view the creatures upon the roof, he let out a soul-tearing scream. Inside the coach, Dot shrank against Patrick. The others, stricken into silence, could only watch as their friend was hauled upward, his legs kicking and flailing past the windows until the glass was spattered with a crimson rain. "Owen!" Rhonda mouthed. Yet her grief was short-lived, for in that terrible instant the roof splintered, and through the perforated metal a dozen iron-hard talons came stabbing. With a dreadful sickening pitch, the coach was lifted off the ground, and the stunned travellers saw the trees beyond the windows fall away. "This isn't happening, right?" Dot mewed, staring down at the shrinking landscape beneath them. Then the shrill cacophony of shrieks and squawks changed into vile laughter. The curved talons were withdrawn from the roof, and the coach plunged through the night. With a thunderous crash it pounded into the ground, and before long most of the wood was ablaze. Before either his brother or father were awake, Neil Chapman stole out of the apartment. The Wyrd Museum was silent as a tomb, and the sound of his footsteps chimed off the polished floors as he hurried to the first floor. Into the room which had once housed the separate collection he went, and began looking inside the chests and boxes. Presently he found what he searched for, the contents of the cabinet which had held Ted for over 50 years. "Wherever you are, Ted," the boy murmured, "I hope you found peace." Another day of school beckoned, yet as he ambled back towards the Egyptian suite, a movement caught his eye. The damaged stuffed raven, which Miss Veronica had wept over, was struggling upon its back. The bird had regenerated itself, yet was still impaired. Only one eye had reformed, and its right wing hung limp and broken. "Don't worry,"
Neil said gently. "I won't hurt you." Slowly, he slid his hand beneath the feathers and lifted the raven so that the scaly feet were standing upon the edge of the chest. Swaying unsteadily, the raven eyed its surroundings. "You look drunk," Neil chuckled.
"Fie!"
the creature cried in a piping voice.
"As merry as a malted mouse this knave doth be. How goeth the day?"
Neil stared at the bird in delight, but he was already too familiar with the strange goings-on within the Wyrd Museum to be surprised at a talking raven. He crouched down and brought his face close to the bird. "Are you all right? My name's Neil. What's yours?" The raven shook its head.
"I know naught save the briny tang in mine gullet and the hammers in mine pate. Wilt thou not appoint unto me a name? Squire Neil, though 'tis said gluttony killeth more than the sword, let me perish with wit enough to answer unto a fair-sounding title."
Neil grinned. "I'll call you Quoth." The raven cocked its head to one side.
"Verily, and amen to that,"
he cried gladly. Suddenly, a distant scream came echoing through the galleries. Neil scrambled to his feet. "That was one of the Websters," he exclaimed. He hastened into the Egyptian suite and the rooms beyond. With his claws clattering over the polished wooden floor, the raven trotted after him. Down the stairs, Miss Ursula Webster came, her face a portrait of despair. "Miss Ursula," Neil ventured, "is everything all right?"
"They are gone," came her leaden reply.
"Who?"
"Veronica and Edith. Can you imagine how long it has been since Veronica left the safety of this building?"
Neil didn't know what to say, but even as he tried to think of something, the raven pattered up behind him.
"So," Miss Ursula snapped, "you have returned."
She snatched him from the ground.
"The disappearance of Edith and Veronica is your master's work."
"Mercy,"
Quoth yammered.
"this tender lamb knows naught."
"Do not lie to me, memory," she raged. "I know your deceits too well."
"Leave him alone," Neil cried. "Can't you see he doesn't know anything about it?" Miss Ursula examined the raven more closely. Catching her breath, she looked at the damaged wing and the shriveled eye socket.
"Yes," she eventually murmured. "The damage was too great for him to repair. No, it was tears which recalled you, memory."
Turning to Neil, she handed the bird to him, and Quoth pressed his beak into the jacket of the boy's uniform.
"Listen to the wisdom of destiny, maggot child. You hold in your embrace a viper. If his mind ever recalls his true identity, then he will undoubtedly turn against you."
"Quoth wouldn't hurt me," Neil objected. The raven chirped in agreement.
"He is mine friend."
Abruptly, the old woman held up her hand for silence.
"Go, child. Answer the door."
Neil frowned. "There's no one there." But even as he uttered these words, there came a faint tinkling noise from the main entrance. The boy descended to the hallway. Slowly, the heavy wooden entrance swung open, and Aidan found himself looking into the face of an 11-year-old boy holding a one-eyed raven. Into the dusty entrance hall of the Wyrd Museum, the place of his annual pilgrimage, Aidan stepped. "Mighty Odor," he breathed worshipfully. Arrayed in her black evening gown, the jet beads glinting in the morning light, Miss Ursula considered him.
"The girl I was to send with you, the one for whom we have hoped and waited for all these years, has disappeared, and Veronica has gone with her. They have been lured away from here."
"Lured? But how? Who?"
"Only one voice other than mine would Veronica attend to. Tremble then when I tell to you that the age-old enemy of the spinners of the wood has returned. It is his hand that lies behind this."
"The gallows guard," he breathed. "Then that answers much. What must I do?" Miss Ursula took his hands in her own.
"Bring them back to the museum. He who has enticed them away desires only their destruction."
The emeralds of the man's eyes sparkled. "Where will I find them?" he asked.
Miss Ursula stared out at the brightening day and sighed.
Veronica and Edith have most certainly gone to Glastonbury.
Then I must set off at once, Aidan cried. Wait, she commanded, and to Neil's surprise he found that the old woman was staring at him.
In the past, boy, I have treated you harshly. If you are able, forgive me. If you wish your thread to be sundered from the web, then speak now. Yet, if you desire to remain a part of the weave, then journey with Aidan. Go with him to Glastonbury.
Me? Neil spluttered. Miss Ursula nodded.
You understand us better than I dare to admit, she said. But most of all, you know Edith.
What about Dad? He stammered.
I will make your father understand, she answered. You can trust Aidan. I do not order you, yet if Veronica and Edith are not returned, then the end of all things creeps a little closer.
This forbidding thought made the hairs on the back of Neil's neck rise, but it was not that which finally made up his mind. Remembering the melancholy that had engulfed him when he had believed his adventures to be over, and realizing that this was his chance to be a part of something exciting again, he found himself saying, I'll go, but Quoth comes with me. Miss Ursula assented.
It will be a time of trial for your newfound companion also. Before it is over, we shall see if Quoth is capable of keeping faith with you. Now, there is no more time to waste. Go immediately.
It was the sound of birdsong which roused Lauren Humphreys. All at once she remembered all that had happened, and ignoring the complaints of her cramped muscles, hurried to the door. "Sheila!" she cried, storming onto the landing and charging into her parents' bedroom. "Dad!" Unwilling to open his eyes just yet, her father stirred grumpily. Her skin a bloodless shade of grey, Lauren's stepmother lay there as large as life. Lauren touched Sheila's cheek. The flesh was hot and clammy. "Dad," she said quietly, "there's something wrong. Look at her." Guy pulled himself up and leaned across his partner's pale form. "She's burning up," he exclaimed, finally surfacing from his doze. "Sheila!" Worriedly, he shook her, and, still with her eyes firmly closed, the woman muttered under her breath, "Look! Look!" "What was that?" Guy asked. Lauren shuddered as a chill gripped her, and she stared at the crow doll hanging from the bedpost. "Wait," she murmured. "Last night, it wasn't there." Sheila's eyelids fluttered open. Her pupils were dark and dilated. "Honey," Guy began, "what's the matter? Shall I call the doctor?" Sheila shook her head. "No," she grunted. "Just so tired." "You lie there, then," Guy said calmly. Slipping from the bed, he closed the window, failing to notice the claw marks gouged into the sill, then led his daughter to the landing. "Looks like she's got this bug that's going round," he said in his usual efficient manner. "Look, Laurie, I've got this really important meeting today." "All right," the girl agreed before the favour was asked. "I'll stay with her." "That's my girl," Guy said. Returning to her room, Lauren sat upon the edge of the bed and tried to make sense of the previous night. What had made that dreadful shrieking noise, and why hadn't it awakened her father? Sheila was certainly not suffering from any ordinary illness, and, remembering the large feather she found, Lauren could not help but think of the crow doll hanging above the woman's head. In the next room, the girl's stepmother lay exhausted under the bedcovers. No trace of the night's trauma remained to plague her waking thoughts, but when she closed her eyes, chaotic flashes leapt into her mind. She felt herself travelling high above the ground, riding upon the wind, while all around her large, shadowy shapes called in harsh, cruel voices. "Look!" the woman whimpered, and with a jolt she came to once more. Sheila threw the bedclothes from her to stagger to the bathroom, then covered her mouth in dismay. About the imprint her body had made in the rumpled sheet
was a filthy collection of twigs and straw. "My God," she whispered desperately. "What's happening?"
After 5 hours on the road, Neil still found Aidan's talk mesmerizing. He listened in fascination as the curious-looking man told him of the time before the world tree was destroyed, and many of the tales of Asgard. "So, what happened when the tree was poisoned?" Neil asked. Aidan's face became grave. "The foul ogres of the north marched upon the world tree, and they hacked at it. As the ash quivered and trembled, only the bravest stood their ground. Those of the royal house, the city guard, and the captain who had gained godlike powers and wisdom by hanging upon Yggdrasil for 9 nights. Woden." Upon Neil's shoulder, Quoth listened. "With Woden at their head, the people of Asgard rode out of the city and bravely charged the enemy." Quoth closed his eyes as the vision of a storm-lashed day abruptly flooded into his thoughts. He was surrounded by an army of warriors on horseback. "Most of the Asgard folk were butchered that day," Aidan told Neil. "Humans are no match for the frost giants. It lasted only until the queen was killed, and then the rest of the city's host were finally routed. When she saw her mother die, the eldest princess called to her 2 sisters and rode with them into a vast unexplored forest." "The Websters?" Neil breathed. Aidan nodded. "Yes. But back then they were known by different names. Urdur, Skuld, and Verdandi. At the outskirts of the forest they were met by a magnificent white stag, who guided them to a wide clearing. There, about a shimmering pool, the sisters beheld the surviving root of Yggdrasil. Urdur saw that upon the banks was the loom which had been made from the fallen bough. Then the earth shook. In the great distance, Yggdrasil toppled and went crashing to the ground, heralding a new eternity of darkness for the world." Aidan fell silent as he manoeuvred the van into the streets of Wells. Then, in a voice filled with reverence, he said, "But of course, that didn't happen, or you and I wouldn't be here now, because in that dreadful moment Urdur did what she had been born to do. To the loom she went, and with the trumpeting yells of the enemy raging at the fringes of the forest, she strung it. At once a protective mist rose about the clearing and shielded them from the Ice Lord's fury. But as soon as the first weft was created, the fate of the world was written, and the Nornir came into being. The princesses became mistresses of destiny, yet to it they were irrevocably bound, and there was no escaping." "So they've been stuck there ever since," Neil muttered, suddenly feeling sorry for the 3 old women. "The museum is built upon the site of the original clearing," Aidan said, "and they have never left its protecting walls. Not until now." "So what happened to the frost giants?" "They returned to the frozen wastes. Until Nirnal dies, they cannot reclaim the everlasting dark, and so they wait." Neil suddenly felt Quoth's claws pinch his shoulder. "Hoy!" he told the raven. "Let go!" But Quoth was not looking at him. Neil followed the raven's gaze. In the distance, rising majestically up into the sky, its grassy shoulders kissed by the wintry midday sun, was the Tor. Neil had never seen anything like it. It was as if he was viewing some ancient mythical land.
"Intimately doth I recall the curve of knoll and mound,"
Quoth muttered quietly. "Not surprising that you remember it," Aidan said, pulling to the side of the road.
"It was to this spot the captain's ravens brought the Princess Verdandi many times. Yet, after he had lashed himself to the world tree, Woden never met her there again."
The van came to a halt, and Aidan stared at the distant hill.
Heavy with myths is the air about Glastonbury, he said in a far-off, spellbound voice. The blessed Isle of Apples. Somerset. It means summer land. In the winter, the sea would flood in, and the Tor, together with Chalice Hill next to it, and Wyrd Hill across the valley, would become true islands. The summer land, Neil echoed. But Chalice Hill, why is it called that? The man breathed deeply. Did no one ever tell you that Jesus Christ came to these shores? That can't be true. Aidan looked at Neil, and the boy was astonished to see that his face was completely serious. The man started the van once more, and continued. Around 2,000 years ago, a boy visited this land with his great-uncle, who was a wealthy merchant. It would have been quite natural for Joseph of Arimathea to set out upon one of these trips. And why shouldn't he let his nephew come along to see something of the world? A much happier voyage, that first one with the young Christ, I imagine, than the one which finally brought Joseph here some time later. What happened on that one? Neil asked. Aidan's dark brows twitched as he answered. It was Joseph who took Jesus' body down from the cross, he said. A most courageous man. Eventually, he left his homeland and came to Britain. But he did not come empty-handed. That's why Chalice Hill is so called. Somewhere around here the Grail resides. Joseph brought it with him. The cup used at the Last Supper? Neil breathed, unable to conceal the scepticism in his voice. Aidan shrugged. Well, maybe not a cup as such, he said. Standing at the foot of the cross, he was supposed to have collected the blood and the sweat of Christ in 2 vessels. Keep your eyes peeled for Verdandi and the young girl, although I'm certain they'll be making straight for the Tor when they arrive, Aidan remarked. We'll park in front of the Chalice Well Gardens. It's not far from there. Chalice Well, Neil murmured. This is also bizarre. 2 springs does this town boast, the red spring and the white. Perhaps that's where the story of Joseph's cruets comes from. Do you know that even in the worst droughts they have never failed? They pulled into a gravel-covered area before a high stone wall, and with a wry smile, Aidan said, This is where the fun begins. Welcome to Avalon. Opening the door, Aidan stepped from the van and waited whilst Neil clambered out of the passenger seat. But the raven shied away from the open door. Nay, he cried, and my asthma of blood doth taint the sweet air. Canst thou not perceive the violent deeds committed in these environs, Master Neil? Neil looked at the bird in surprise. I can't smell anything, he said. Come on, it's probably just your scrambled brains playing tricks. He told Quoth to climb onto his fingers, and fearfully the bird obeyed. Crunching over the gravel, they walked back to the road, but before they could proceed any further, there came the sound of running footsteps. Aidan! A voice cried. Thank heavens it's you! The gypsy and Neil turned to see, hurrying from the entrance to the Chalice Well Gardens, a man in dark blue overalls. Isn't it awful? He called. I still can't believe it. George, Aidan replied. I've been away and only got back this minute. Then you don't know, the man whispered. It's Rhonda and the others. Aidan stiffened. What about them? Last night, their bus blew up. Oh, God, it's so dreadful. Neil glanced at Aidan's face. A fierce emerald blaze burned in his eyes. I must go to them, the gypsy said. I have to know what happened. Tearing back across the gravel, he yanked open the van door. Wait, Neil shouted. You can't go. What about Veronica and Edie? Aidan's features twisted as the turmoil raged within him, until, finally he said, This is all part of it. I have a horrible feeling I know what's happened to my friends. I have to find out for sure. But what about me? Go up the Tor. If Verdandi and the girl are there, bring them down here and wait until I return. An hour at the most, that's all I'll be, I promise. With a roar, the engine started, and the van reversed back into the road. Watching the exhaust fumes disappear round a bend, the boy worriedly turned to the raven upon his shoulder. They were stranded in an unfamiliar place, with no one to help them. Something malevolent was at work here,
and Neil felt a twinge of fear grip his stomach. Following Aidan's counsel, he took the Wellhouse Lane approach to the tor. The climb was not difficult, for a stepped pathway had been cut into the inclining turf. Pausing to gaze at the odd, solitary structure, that tall stone finger which claimed the pagan site in the name of the Archangel, the boy assured himself that it could not be much further. Yet, just when he thought he had neared the summit, he discovered that he had only reached a shoulder-like formation, and that there was still some distance to go along the tor's deceptively long spine. Sitting patiently by the boy's ear, Quoth delighted in the lofty airs which streamed through his feathers. He longed to be able to soar over the treetops, but his right wing was still too weak. The tower grew larger with every step, until finally Neil was standing before its gaping arch. "Well, there's no one else here but you and me," he said to Quoth. "There's no rain dew. Not this day nor the next," came a sudden, unexpected voice. Neil whirled around and stared into the archway. Sitting upon a stone bench and half hidden in the shadows was a shabbily dressed old man.
"Gets you in under cover afore they spots you, lad."
"Who did you see?" the boy asked. "Was it an old lady and a young girl?" With a shake of his head, the trampish figure pulled off his grimy cap.
"Never been so scared in his life as poor Tommy,"
he gibbered.
"Feathers black with beaks and claws deadly sharp. But Tommy were lucky. He was watched over, so them nasties never spied him a-hiding there."
The boy gave him a humouring nod.
"Soon as day came, Tommy scampered from that barn,"
the old man wailed.
"but he forgot his precious belongings. When the night comes, he won't have no protection this time."
The old man gave a morose sniff. Then his eyes lit up.
"You go with Tommy, won't you, lad?"
he declared suddenly, with a wide smile that revealed his few remaining teeth.
"He won't be so afeard with a bit of company, and it won't get dark for a while longer."
Neil spluttered, I'm sorry, I've got to wait here." Tommy stepped from the archway, glanced warily at the sky, and grunted.
"We won't be long. Just nip down and collect Tommy's gear."
With that he turned and headed for a second track that lay behind the tower and which zigzagged down the tor. Uncertain of what to do, Neil gazed back at the road, but there was still no sign of either Edie, Veronica, or Aidan.
"For all his years, the clot is fleet of foot,"
the raven observed, watching the old man disappear below the rim of the hill. "Right," Neil decided. "I'll have to go after him. He must be linked to this. If only you could fly, then you could stay here and come find me when Aidan or the others arrive." Quoth hung his head in shame and trilled a pathetic cheep. "Oh, never mind," Neil told him, breaking into a run. Down the far side of the immense hill they went, with Neil plying the old man with questions, but all Tommy cared about was the retrieval of his beloved possessions. Plodding alongside him, the boy listened to his concerned mutterings as they crossed barren fields, until Tommy abruptly halted and caught hold of Neil's arm.
"This is it,"
he exclaimed, jabbing a thumb over the hedge towards a dilapidated barn. "Well, let's go and get your stuff," Neil prompted.
"Not so hasty,"
the tramp answered, scrutinizing the derelict building.
"Might not be safe. Though it's still early, they could have come back."
The boy looked at him intently. "Who is this they you keep talking about?" he asked. Tommy wiped his nose on the sleeve of his overcoat.
"Why doesn't you ask that there bird of yours?" he murmured. "Tommy done heard that feathered duster speak to you, and if there's anyone who can sniff these demons out, it'll be the likes of him."
Quoth paced up and down Neil's shoulder as he lifted his beak into the breeze to sniff the cold air.
"Nay,"
he declared,
"though the reek of violence doth make my quills tingle, I fail to find aught of special mark touching yonder hovel."
The tramp smacked his lips and rubbed his hands together.
"That's good enough for Tommy,"
he proclaimed, happily pushing through the hedge. Neil followed the old man around the side of the barn to where a rotting wooden door stood wide open. A pleasant, sweet-smelling dusk filled the ruined barn.
"Here we are,"
Tommy chatted to himself, negotiating his way between heaps of lumber and crossing to the corner where a mound of tires was partially covered by a tarpaulin.
"This is where Tommy done hid himself last night,"
he told Neil.
"Nipped under there real quick he did, as soon as he heard them a-circling overhead. But 'twas only 'cause he had his collection with him that he was spared."
The tramp reached into one of the tires and then cleared a space upon a rickety dresser before emptying the contents of the bag for the boy to see. It was a mass of religious trinkets, postcards, small plastic figures, scraps of gift wrapping, anything that depicted an angel.
"Angels have always kept Tommy safe from harm," the old man murmured. "That's how he made it through the Great War. Came down to rescue him from the Kaiser's soldiers, they did."
"You mean the Second World War," Neil corrected. The old man sucked his gums thoughtfully.
"No," he said at length. "'Twas the Great War. Tommy was at Mons, you see. In the Great Retreat, through the clouds of gunsmoke he saw 'em, the heavenly host."
"But that can't be," Neil mumbled, ignoring the ludicrous story of the angels for the moment. "If you were fighting then, it would make you nearly 100.
"Ah," the tramp sighed. "Tommy's had a good innings, that's true enough. But after the battle, he couldn't remember out. So bright and glorious were the shining ones as they came charging out of heaven that it made him forget. If Tommy did have a family or a sweetheart awaiting, then he never knew."
Lapsing into regretful silence, the old man began to gather up his collection. From the yard outside there came the ugly sound of crows calling, and the tramp instantly shrank fearfully behind the door.
"Keep quiet now," he hushed. "Thems might be ordinary birds, and then again, they might not."
I've got to get back to the tor," Neil insisted. Tommy turned to stare at him, and the boy was startled to see a ferocious scowl contorting the tramp's face.
"You'll not go nowhere till Tommy tells you," he growled.
Neil glanced at Quoth.
"He's nuts,"
he hissed out of the corner of his mouth. The bird squinted at the tramp, then slyly nodded towards the hayloft and its broken shutters. The boy understood, and when the old man turned his attention back to the yard, spying upon the crows through a crack in the door, he crept towards the wooden ladder which led to the barn's upper level. Silently, Neil climbed the aged rungs. Yet, as soon as he reached the straw-covered platform above, the bird gave a frightened shriek and toppled from his shoulder. "What is it?" Neil cried.
"Fie! Fie!"
the raven shrieked, running around in a circle.
"Fiends, cruel and murderous hath been here. I perceive their foul scents. 10 at least were their number."
Shaken by Quoth's words, Neil rose and walked over to the opening and gazed out at the tor in the distance. Already the daylight was growing dim, and the boy reproached himself for ever leaving the vicinity of the tower.
"No, you don't, boy,"
Tommy snapped, seizing hold of Neil's arms and dragging him from the edge.
"Get off!"
Neil yelled, battling to free himself, whilst Quoth lunged for the tramp's feet and pecked at his ankles.
"Ouch! Ow!"
the tramp yelped.
"Tommy didn't mean to scare. He were worried about them crows, that's all."
"Quoth!" Neil commanded. "Leave him alone!" Obediently, the raven bounded back to him, and Tommy eyed the boy with gratitude.
"You was too close to the brink," he breathed. You might have fell."
"All you had to do was tell me."
"Tommy was scared of them crows," he whispered. "He don't think too good when he's frighted."
Neil said, feeling foolish for doubting Tommy's good nature. There wasn't a shred of harm in him.
"This is where they were,"
Tommy blurted, dropping to his knees to forage and grub about amongst the straw with his bare hands.
"Awful noisy and all, with their nasty voices and foul way of talking. Tommy heard them scrabbling about, and look!"
There, poking from the hay, were 2 huge black feathers. Neil reached out to take them, but Quoth beat his hand back with his wings.
"Touch not that evil filth," he squawked. "The little fellow's right," Tommy agreed. "Better to pick up hot coals than mess with those."
Neil looked up at the old man in confusion. "What's going on around here?"
"This is where they've made their gathering place," the tramp uttered fearfully.
"But who are these creatures?"
"The same as what killed them nice folk in the bright bus late last night," Tommy answered darkly. "Heard 'em croaking about it, Tommy did. Heard 'em licking their claws and cleaning their beaks." "We must leave here," he said urgently. "See how the light fails outside. They're certain sure to be back tonight."
In the centre of Glastonbury, a small bus came to a halt. Miss Veronica gingerly stepped from the vehicle and gazed around.
"My, how it is altered," she cooed to Edie. "Yet still I can feel the ancient power here."
Taking the girl's hand, Miss Veronica hobbled up the street.
"There it is," she cried, jabbing her cane towards the end of the lane. "Innis Witrin. Oh, we were so happy there, Edith, me and the captain."
Yet, as Edie gazed upon the beautiful green mountain, a coldness crept into her heart. Hunched over the handlebars of her bicycle, Lauren Humphreys hardly glanced at the figures of Edie and Miss Veronica when she flew past them. Shortly after lunch, although still unwell, Sheila had driven off to the cash and carry to stock up. Into Magdalene Street Lauren sped, her flame-coloured hair flowing behind her. When she rounded the corner of the high street, she took her feet off the pedals and dismounted. One shop in particular, called Moonshine, held Lauren's attention. It was where Sheila had purchased the Crow doll. After a moment's hesitation, she entered. The owner of the shop was sitting behind the till. Normally an attractive, bubbly woman, that afternoon Dulcimer Pettigrew looked irritable and tired. Lauren's gaze shifted to an object that was hanging behind the woman's head. Wearing a hat of black straw and a dark brown checked dress was a Crow doll.
"Why don't you have it?" Dulcimer said. "It's the last one. There were only 12.
Trying to hide the revulsion she felt, Lauren gazed at the cloth crow creature.
"Who made them?" she asked. "Was it you?"
The woman laughed.
"No, someone far cleverer than I is responsible."
"What does the writing on the apron mean?" Lauren asked.
"This one's different from my stepmother's. Hers says, 'Lock,' but the stitches here read, 'Girl.'"
"Shrieker and Screamer," Dulcimer informed her. "And the one that owns me is Skirgle, which means raging."
"Owns you?"
The smile disappeared from Miss Pettigrew's face. "Do you want the Crow doll or don't you?" she demanded.
"No, thanks,"
the girl replied. In the courtyard outside, Lauren watched the tourists mill in and out of the shops until a woman she recognized as being local wandered into Moonshine. After several minutes, she came out with a parcel wrapped in dark blue paper, printed with silver stars and circles. Lauren guessed at once what the package contained, and her suspicions were confirmed when Miss Pettigrew closed the shop a short while later.
"At last," she heard the woman laugh. "We are complete."
A network of fluorescent tapes crisscrossed the country road, threading into the nearby wood. A small blue van skidded to a halt in the middle of the road, and an oddly dressed man came leaping out to charge towards the tape barriers.
"Hey!"
a policeman yelled.
"You can't come through here!"
Aidan slithered beneath the cordon.
"Who's in charge here?"
he demanded.
"Aidan."
"Thank God!" Hastening from the trees came Chief Inspector Hargreaves.
"So, Charlie,"
Aidan said quietly,
"what happened?"
"We haven't a clue how the vehicle was moved. No tire marks. Nothing." With a profound sadness, Aidan gazed upon the campsite of his friends. This was where he had left them only the previous evening.
"Did you find anything?" he asked.
The Chief Inspector moved a little further across the grass.
"There was some blood over here," he stated. "We don't know whose yet. Leader, they're all dead."
"I guessed that they would be." Through the trees Hargreaves led him, and the unpleasant smell of burnt timber mounted steadily. Then, as they progressed onto ground that was still smouldering, the Chief Inspector turned.
"This is it," he said.
Aidan gazed upon the shattered remains of the cheerfully painted coach his friends had once lived in.
"Rhonda, Luke, Owen, Dot,
Patrick," Aidan grieved.
"This was no accident. Something is stirring, Charlie. Something great and terrible."
He went to take a closer look at the wreck.
"Charlie!" he shouted abruptly. "Come see this!"
Hargreaves hastened over to where the gypsy was kneeling.
"This is a section of the roof," Aidan remarked. "But what do you make of these ragged holes?"
"As if something ripped clean through it on purpose," the Chief Inspector breathed.
"That's exactly what happened. The bus was seized by the roof and hoisted off the ground. Then it was dropped here."
Hargreaves rose.
"What on earth could have done that?"
Aidan ran his fingers over the jagged rents, and in a despairing voice murmured,
"Valkyria."
"Valkyries?"
"Charlie," Aidan said in a hushed tone, "you're descended from Asgard folk, same as me. The tales say that only the hosts were vanquished. Somehow the 12 servants of Woden have returned. I have to get back to Glastonbury."
Taking hold of the policeman's hand, Aidan shook it desperately.
"The destiny of the fates themselves is in your keeping now," the Chief Inspector whispered hoarsely.
Twilight came early to the trackway leading up to the tour, but Edie and Miss Veronica doggedly plodded upwards. Presently they came to a metal gateway, and the inspiring spectacle of the Tor was unveiled before them. Taking her walking cane in both bony hands, Miss Veronica lifted the pearl handle to her crabbed lips.
"Awaken," she crooned softly. "Verdandi summons you, O rod of life and doom."
The cane crackled in her hands, and a wondrous radiance flooded over the pathway. Bathed in dazzling beams, Miss Veronica bowed her head. Then, squeezing her brittle bones through the gate, she set foot upon the grassy slopes of the Tor. Edie scampered after her. Like melting ice, the ages dissolved from Miss Veronica. Her eyes sparkled a cornflower blue, and jet-black hair flowed behind her lithe figure like a river. The dirty silk robe now rippled and shone. Glastonbury had completely vanished. In shedding the years from Miss Veronica, the measuring rod of the Nornir had taken them both back to a time in her youth. Higher they ascended, yet the crest of the Tor was not deserted, for a figure was standing up there. "Do you see?" Verdandi exclaimed, catching her breath. "He is there, my captain." Silhouetted against the azure sky was the outline of a man, and circling above him flew a large black raven. He, like Verdandi, was young. Long flaxen hair curled past his shoulders, whilst in the shade of his silver helm a pair of dark eyes glittered. "Woden!" Verdandi cried, releasing Edie's hand to run the remaining short distance and throw her slender arms about him. The man looked down upon the dark tresses of her hair, but did not reach out to hold her. At once the raven fluttered down to land upon his cloaked shoulder. Verdandi's fine brows twitched with uncertainty. "Do you still blame me for Udur's actions?" she entreated. "How I have cursed her for making me ride with her to Nirenel. I would have stayed by your side in the battle. You know that." Woden let out a sigh. "I must tell you the truth."
"Princess,"
the bird cawed,
"permit me to speak for my master. To glimpse you once more was all he craved. He is soon to die."
"Is it true?" Verdandi whispered. Woden frowned as though struggling to answer, and Thought's eyes glinted warningly at him. "It is," the man finally said. Verdandi clutched his hands and pressed them to her cheek. "Then we can never be together," she wept.
"Perhaps,"
the raven said archly,
"and yet perhaps not. My master can indeed be saved by one rare and precious thing which was brought from over the waters and now lies upon the breast of a hermit long dead below yonder ground."
Verdandi spun around to scan the swamp at the foot of the Tor. "I would plunder 1,000 tombs to save him." Then, lifting her cane, she cried, "Reveal to me the resting place of he who came from over the seas." In the midst of the treacherous tracts of mud, Edie saw that the ground was beginning to move. Suddenly, a piece of the land fell away, and from the darkness below there shot a silver-green flame. With a last look at her captain, Verdandi began to hurry down the Tor. Soon, safe ground gave way to sinking mud. Through obstructing reeds, Edie and Verdandi crashed, stumbling into the clearing where the flame towered over them. Then it boiled upwards in a momentous fireball. "Quickly!" Verdandi declared, staring at the deep fissure in the ground. A roughly fashioned staircase had been cut into the rock. Verdandi ran to the topmost step and began to descend. Edie scampered after her. Into the earth they pressed, the daylight rapidly fading to a spectral dusk which was barely enough to illumine the steps beneath their feet. Then the girl heard Verdandi sigh with relief. "The steps are ended," echoed the woman's voice. "But another passage begins." Suddenly, down the stairs cascaded a torrent of soil and stones, and Verdandi hauled the child to one side. "No!" the woman cried, as up above the two sides of the fissure moved together. "What is it?" the girl cried. Invisible in the strangling blackness, the woman answered in a weary voice. "We're sealed in, and time has rushed by above. Oh, Edith, I am old once more." Above the ground the ages blurred. The warrior's face shimmered, the blonde hair turning dark and unkempt. Staggered by what he had just experienced, the Reverend Peter Galloway drew a hand over his face. Thought looked at him sternly.
"Thy foolish tongue near spoiled our Lord's intricate design."
"I'm sorry," Peter apologized, "but I don't understand why we had to lie." The raven cackled.
"Thou art here to fulfill our Lord's wishes, not query them."
Peter nodded slowly.
"Then let us be gone,"
Thought crowed, rising into the air.
"The 12 are waking."
Deep in the earth, Edie Dorkins and Miss Veronica Webster gradually became aware of a lessening in the profound blackness. In the distance, a faint radiance began to glimmer. It emanated from a low archway cut into the stone. The arch was an opening to a much larger space, and standing upon the threshold, with the soft, silvery light playing across her young features, Edie peered within. In the centre of the chamber was a large wattle hut.
"What is this place?"
she asked.
"A tomb, dear," the old woman answered. "Let us take the device and go quickly."
Within the hut, upon a long, low plinth of granite, and flanking a large lead box, were 2 sealed vessels made of the purest silver. Beating from their untarnished, brilliant metal, a heavenly radiance poured. Miss Veronica shuffled alongside the granite plinth and placed her bony hand upon one end of the large lead box.
"What we seek lies within this coffin."
Quickly, Edie's nimble fingers worked the soft lead flanges of the cover free, and, with Miss Veronica's help, she pulled it clear. Within the open coffin lay an elderly man, dressed in simple hermit's robes. A mane of dark grey hair filled the casket, twining with a long white beard which spread over his chest. Parting a space through the dense hay-like layers, Miss Veronica revealed a circular golden object.
"There it is," she whispered, "the healing treasure. Forgive me this act of robbery, my dearest sir."
With infinite gentleness, she closed her fingers about the precious yellow metal and lifted it from the dead man's breast. Encrusted with gold and gems, the device was like a large bracelet, hammered from one single piece of tapering metal, and it gave off a pale light.
"Can't see how that'll help,"
Edie said flatly.
"Nor do I,"
Miss Veronica whispered.
"but there is a power within it all the same. It prickles and stings."
"That's the same thing what Ursula wanted me to fetch, ain't it? She said it were dangerous."
Miss Veronica began to limp towards the doorway.
"I really couldn't vouch for anything Ursula might have said."
Edie lingered in the hut for a moment more. It seemed a shame to leave the 2 vessels behind. She reached over to take one. As soon as she touched the cold, brilliant metal, a tremendous roar shook the chamber. Edie stared about her in horror, then fled towards the doorway, leaping across an ever-growing fissure to be at Miss Veronica's side. But the jagged fragment of ground beneath her slithered downward, whilst Miss Veronica was flung helplessly into the empty darkness, and the circlet they had come so far to find was sent spinning out of her grasp. Tommy, Neil and Quoth soon joined the main road. Tommy suddenly noticed a single light travelling shakily down the road and immediately recognised the plump figure which sat behind it. "How do?" he shouted. Lauren Humphreys applied the brakes of her bicycle.
"Tommy," she cried, "there is something weird going on here." "Hail and well met,"
Quoth chattered. Lauren stared at the bird, and Neil hastily wrapped his fingers over Quoth's beak.
"Don't you mind that overgrown sparrow,"
the tramp told her.
"Forget the bird," Lauren said. "I have to talk to someone about what's happening. My stepmother's caught up in it. I don't understand how, but the Crow dolls are responsible. You've got to help me, Tommy. If we can just get home before my stepmother goes to bed, then I can throw the foul thing onto the fire and she'll be all right."
The girl was shivering with fear.
"Tommy'll go with you," he agreed. "But if and we're too late, then he ain't stopping."
A short while later, they were all walking up the drive to the Humphreys. Sheila's car was parked at the side of the house, and a wedge of cheering yellow light streamed from the kitchen window.
"Well, she's home,"
Lauren commented, leaning her bicycle against the wall. She pushed open the kitchen door. "Hello?" she called. The kitchen was empty, and the rest of the ground floor was in darkness. "She must have already gone to bed," she told the others. "I'll go see if she's asleep." "Don't you do nowt barmy now," Tommy cautioned. Switching on the landing light, Lauren ascended the stairs. When she reached the landing, she breathed a sigh of relief, for a rosy glow was shining beneath the door. Her stepmother might still be awake. "Sheila," Lauren whispered, tapping lightly upon the wood. Gingerly she turned the handle and pushed the door open. Lying on top of the covers, the girl's stepmother stirred feebly. Lauren lay a hand upon the woman's forehead. It was hot and fevered. Hanging from the bedpost, the effigy of the crow doll appeared just as she had last seen it. Curbing her revulsion, Lauren reached out to steal the vile thing. As soon as her fingers closed about it, Sheila's eyes snapped open. "Stop!" she yelled. "What are you doing?" "I'm taking the doll away," came the swift reply. "That's what's making you ill." Lashing out with more strength than Lauren could have imagined possible, Sheila snatched the crow doll from her stepdaughter's grasp. "Look!" came a despairing hiss. "The crimson weft must be woven." Lauren hurried out onto the landing, closed the door after her, and ran down the stairs to where Tommy and Neil were waiting. "It's no use," she told them. "I tried to take it, but she went mad and snatched it back." "Didst the dame have aught to say?" Quoth cried abruptly. Lauren frowned at the creature in disbelief. "It's really talking," she exclaimed. "Well, answer him then," Neil told her. "There was something," the girl murmured, "about a crimson weave." "A crimson weft," Quoth corrected with dread. Leaning upon the table, Neil peered at the raven. "You're remembering something, aren't you?" he marvelled. "In the distant days," the raven began softly, "after the ogres of frost were abashed, Quoth's lord had dominion over all things, yet over destiny his power was as naught. Thus, in his envy and rage, did he invoke spirits of death and despair, and unto them he sacrificed maidens, in which they made their earthly abodes. 12 such terrors there were, fiends of savagery and carnage, Valkyrie." "And these things are here now?" Neil muttered. The raven bowed. "To overthrow the Nornir, they were created long ages since. Yet the enchantment of the fates could not be breached, and the host of Woden was scattered or slain. Now 'twould seem the 12 are rising once more." Suddenly, from Lauren's parents' bedroom, there came a horrific scream. "The spirit possesseth her," Quoth jabbered. "No!" Lauren wept. Sheila's voice was changing. The agonized howls were now totally unhuman. "That's it," the old man whispered in recognition. "That's the racket Tommy heard last night. Oh, Lord, send us angels!" Then the door slowly opened. Upon the landing, an immense dark shape appeared. Throwing back its ghastly head, a high, prolonged, piercing screech blasted from the nightmare's gullet. Up in their sockets, the light bulbs exploded. Darkness engulfed them, and the Valkyrie descended. Framed by a mane of spiked feathers, the misshapen head was a nauseating fusion of human features combined with that of a monstrous raven. Grey, scab-ridden flesh crusted the grotesque countenance that was dominated by a vicious, spearing beak. The monstrosity eyed its victims greedily. Then, with murderous shrieks, it lunged straight for Neil. Sharp, clattering quills beat upon his face, and cruel claws came ripping through the shadows, smashing him violently to the ground. As the distorted, harrowing face descended, Neil waited for the blow, when suddenly his attacker let out a furious screech, and he stared up to see Lauren gripping the great, hideous head in her hands, battling to drag it back. The girl cried out in pain. The feathers were like razors and sliced deep into her hands. The Valkyrie tore its head away, and the girl was left clutching a handful of barbed feathers. Now Lauren was in peril. "The controlling doll," Quoth howled, desperately flapping his wings. "If thou canst wrench it free!" In another moment, a dreadful scream resounded in the kitchen. Hlurk fell backwards, its clawed feet tearing everything in their path. Convulsing spasms racked its being. Amazed, Neil heard Lauren's voice cry, "Tommy!"
You saved us.
The old tramp nodded dumbly. In his large hands he held the crow doll he had torn from the monster's neck. Quoth hurried over to Neil.
Art thou injured?
He asked. I think I'll live, he replied, grimacing where he ran his fingers over a bloody but shallow wound in his side.
Tommy's collection was what saved the day, the tramp muttered. It's them what gave his braveness back, but he'll not touch this filth no more.
He cast the cloth image across the kitchen, where it spun over the floor and was lost beneath one of the cupboards. Lauren gazed down at the melting darkness that had been the Valkyrie. Already it was human again, and she knelt beside the now motionless figure of her stepmother.
I need light, she said. There's matches and candles in the drawer over there.
Neil rummaged in the shadows until he found what he sought. He lit one of the candles, but before he could give it to Lauren, he heard Quoth squawk in alarm. From under the cupboard, the crow doll had dragged itself and advanced towards the unconscious woman it had claimed as its host.
Tommy's braveness is gone, the tramp wailed. He has to get himself to the tower.
Incapable of facing any more horror, he lurched for the door and scuttled outside.
No, you don't,
Lauren yelled, diving to snatch up the creature.
This time you're for the fire. Bring me that candle.
Neil came forward, but in doing so, the candle glow fell upon Sheila's face, and the boy beheld the woman for the first time.
Mum,
he whispered. There upon the floor, Lauren's stepmother, the human host of Shrieker, who only minutes ago had tried to butcher them all, was Neil's own mother, Sheila Chapman. Since abandoning her family over 4 months ago, this was the first time the boy had seen her, and a raw numbness consumed him. His delay was all that Hliok required. Into Lauren's hair the twigs suddenly went winding, spiking into her scalp and stretching about her neck. The girl doubled up with agony as her arms snapped and splintered, stretching to form the skeletal frame of a huge pair of wings. Neil plunged his hands into her hair, where the crow doll had rooted itself, but nothing he could do would prise it loose. Lauren's jaws split as the first points of a lethally sharp beak speared forth.
Master Neil,
Quoth cried, reeling towards him.
Thou must flee whilst ye may. An instant more, and she shall be feasting upon thee.
Grasping his mother by the arms, Neil tried to drag her towards the door.
Hliok will not harm this one,
the raven squawked.
The scent of the Valkyrie is still strong upon her. Fly!
Plucking up the raven, Neil bolted for the door and flung himself through it. Then, slamming it behind him, he pelted out into the darkness. But before he knew what was happening, 2 strong hands had caught him by the shoulders.
Fates preserve us,
cried Aidan, letting go of Neil's shoulders when he saw the horror of the Valkyrie burst from the kitchen.
Aye,
Quoth yammered.
We art caught!
Not yet, Aidan yelled, setting off down the path, hauling Neil after him.
Get into the van!
Feverishly, Aidan yanked open the van door, and Neil tore around to the passenger side to clamber within. Aidan turned the key in the ignition, and the van leapt forward.
Hurroosh!
Quoth cheered, but his jubilation was curtailed, for the Valkyrie was spreading immense wings. Trees and hedges rocketed by as the van hurtled along the lonely road towards Glastonbury, but with every passing second the ravaging Valkyrie closed in.
Sacred ancient sights are what we need now,
Aidan said through gritted teeth. At that moment the roof buckled and warped as a curved talon came ripping inside, and the van lurched across the road.
Hold on,
Aidan yelled, turning the van sharply around to career down Beer Lane. But the terrifying creature did not follow, as though hearing a distant call. It vanished into the darkness above. Quoth clacked his tongue in warning.
It hath gone to fetch aid, he said.
Neil stared out of the window and saw the lights of the town fall behind them.
This is Wyrd Hill, he suddenly realized. What's up here?
Something to keep you safe, Aidan rapped back. Abruptly the buildings which flanked the road ended. Aidan stopped the van and got out.
You're crazy,
Neil cried, gazing at the empty expanse which stretched before them.
If more of these things come, we'll be done for out there.
Aidan explained impatiently.
Joseph of Arimathea came ashore here and rested upon this hill, and when he planted his staff in the ground, it took root and flowered.
A scion of that tree is up there on the hillside. Just keep running straight and you can't miss it. It's ringed about by a railing. As soon as you reach it, hold on and don't let go for anything. But what are you going to do? Aidan stared back across the valley to where he could just make out the black silhouette of the tor. They'll all be swarming this way in a minute, he said grimly. Urdur sent me to find Verdandi and the girl, but I failed her. There's only one thing I can do to redeem myself now. She told you to trust me. Well, I'll not break that faith. Those creatures never abandon their prey when they give chase. If I leave now, I might just be able to lead them off and give you time enough to reach the thorn. You don't stand a chance, Neil cried. I know, the gypsy said solemnly, so don't let it be for nothing. Get running.
Wait! Neil bawled, but Aidan was already slamming the van's door behind him. He held up his hand in farewell, then drove the vehicle back down the hill. Neil could not believe what the man had done. Good luck, was all he could bring himself to say. Deep shadows filled Tommy's derelict barn. Behind the Reverend Peter Galloway there came a fluttering of wings, and Thought, the raven, flew over his head to alight upon the remains of an old tractor.
The hour of the gathering is at hand. Let us betake ourselves to the loft up yonder and await our guests. Pox and plague,
the raven exclaimed when he landed upon the straw-covered floorboards.
Others hath been here this very day.
Could it have been that young woman and the child? Peter asked. Thought glared at him and ruffled his feathers.
Not they,
he denied.
I like it not at all.
About that woman, Peter persisted. Isn't it time she returned with the chalice?
Faith, fellow servant,
the bird assured him.
Soon they wilt return, and the golden prize shalt prove our master's existence.
The vicar gave a weak smile. I know, he said. From this night on the world will be a different place. No more wars, no sickness, no pain.
The world will indeed be changed,
Thought admitted.
Yet afore the dawn thy faith wilt be tested. Flinch not from what awaits thee, and obey my bidding.
Peter nodded. The raven strutted over to the wide opening.
Yet not alone shalt thou perform thy duties,
he said cryptically.
The servants of my master will soon be here. A most sacred host are they, yet their aspect wilt fright and afflict thee.
A few minutes later, Peter sat bolt upright as a faint yammering came from outside, and Thought glided over to the man's shoulder.
They are here,
he cried.
The 12 art gathered at last.
The Reverend Galloway prepared himself to be overcome by the sight of this angelic host. Suddenly, screaming at the top of its foul voice, the first of the nightmares plunged in through the opening. Peter's skin crawled when the atrocity shook its feathers, and its grotesque, inhuman eyes glittered malevolently at him. Then a second and a third nightmare came crashing inside. They are sent by the Lord, the vicar kept telling himself. I am in no danger. 11 ghastly, feather-fringed heads now bobbed and twitched within the cramped loft space. Every bitter beak croaked and screeched, and lethal talons splintered through the floorboards as they pushed and jostled each other, preparing to pounce upon the paltry human who had dared to intrude.
Be still,
the raven cried.
I, Thought, command it. This mortal is high in our master's regard. No injury wilt I permit thee to inflict upon his person.
Just then, the noise of beating wings came rushing about the barn, and into the hayloft her look came. Furling its wings, the unholy creature which had consumed Lauren Humphreys stood upon the ledge and gave a calamitous scream.
Why are you here?
The monster demanded of Thought. The raven blinked at the insolent question.
I I am the emissary of thy creator, he declaimed. 'Tis not thy place to challenge me. What truth is there in your words, the creature demanded, when your own brother assists our enemy? Memory, he screeched. My brother lives? He does, and has renounced our master. Even now he rides with two who stink of Nirinel. They are here to defeat us. This very night I was assailed and wrenched from my host. A power was with them I could not understand. The other creatures clacked their dismay, but thought narrowed his eyes. Hark, O devoted servants, he declared. The hour-long awaited fast approacheth. The dandy hath been enticed from the shrine's protection, and unto us she shalt deliver the device our lord doth seek. A croaking chorus rang about the loft as the Valkyries screamed their approval, and Thought stretched his wings dramatically. My brother must be taken. Shrieker, lead us to these fools. They must be slain. The barn shuddered as the monsters thundered from the opening to soar into the dark night. What's happening? The Reverend Galloway asked. A Judas hath been discovered, Thought snapped. We must find him afore the prize is brought to us. Now, make thyself ready. There came a fierce rush of feathers, and a putrid stench blasted upon the vicar's face as one of the circling Valkyries plunged towards him. He felt his arms almost wrenched from their sockets as the winged horror above snatched him into the air. Dear Lord! Peter howled, closing his eyes. Like a black storm, the Valkyries went screeching into the tortured night. Down into the pit Edie fell, clinging to her splintered section of rocky floor, until the bottom of the great dark chasm was finally reached. With the dreadful, jolting violence of the impact, the child was thrown clear. Opening her eyes, she sat up to find herself in a large drift of feathery frost. The cavern, which had lain beneath the hermit's tomb, was immense. All around, rising like a forest of shimmering crystal columns, were pillars of ice. Lying upon their sides, dented but not broken, the silver cruets still blazed their glorious light, and it was this which illuminated the gargantuan space. Miss Veronica stumbled into the light, looking only slightly the worse for wear after her hideous descent. Edie ran across the rubble to hug her. "Why ain't you killed after dropping all that way?" "The same reason you aren't, dear," came the amused reply. "There is very little that could do us serious harm. We have drunk of the blessed waters. The healing treasure," she suddenly exclaimed. "It fell from my hand." Edie's sharp eyes scanned the way ahead. After several minutes of having to squeeze between stalagmites and constantly losing her footing upon the frozen floor, the child suddenly saw a pale radiance ahead. She ducked beneath a formation of iridescent ice and slid to a wide area of white frost, ringed about by boulders of polished black rock. In the centre of this strange circle, half buried in the snowy carpet, lay the golden ornament. Kneeling upon the freezing ground, Edie lifted the bracelet, and a cloud of vapour issued from her lips as she gasped and let it fall once more. The metal was horrible to touch. It tingled and stabbed her skin, and she pulled her hands up into the sleeve of her coat before attempting to pick it up again. Then her gaze fell upon the place where the treasure had lain. "Veronica!" she yelled. "Over here!" The polished black stones which surrounded her were the edge of a great pool, and Edie was crouching upon its frozen surface. Down into the shadowy depths shone the pale glow of the treasure, and the child gazed upon the incredible sight it revealed. A pair of large round eyes were staring up at her. Beneath them, all the girl could make out was a wide forehead, crowned by a mass of hair which resembled tangled river weeds. "Oh, well done, Edith dear," came Miss Veronica's voice as the old woman approached the frozen pool. Carefully climbing over the ring of boulders, she crept to the young girl's side, where her jaw dropped open in astonishment.
"Gracious me!" she cried. "I don't believe it! An undine! And a male one at that!"
The girl grinned.
"What's one of them?" "Undines are water spirits, dear. In the beginning of things, they roamed in the great oceans. They are the fount of all sacred wells and springs. Long ago, such a glorious being dwelt in the pool beneath Nirenel."
Edie turned back to gaze upon the frozen creature sealed within the ice.
"You had one of them under the museum?" "Phew," she whistled. "What happened to it?"
"The creature was lured away," Miss Veronica replied. "That is why, when the well was drained, the blessed water was never replenished."
"I want to let it out," Edie cried.
"Stand aside,"
Miss Veronica instructed. She held out the cane and tapped it once upon the ice. A flicker of green flame travelled down the black rod, shooting out over the frozen water until a loud crack resounded throughout the cavern and the ice split. It was like looking upon an ogre of the unlit deep. Between the great eyes, 2 slits served as nostrils, and below them a wide fish-like mouth opened to draw its first liquid breath for countless years. A scaly chin joined onto the creature's chest, but the undine's shoulders were huge knots of shining, sinewy flesh, fringed with webbed spines. The eyes of the water spirit swiveled until they came to rest upon the 2 puny figures standing beyond the rim of its domain. Over the polished black stones the icy water crashed, drenching the figures of Edie and Miss Veronica as the ancient power came bursting to the surface. The monstrous figure towered over them, a drizzle of rain teeming from the long hanks of dark green hair that hung heavily over the pulsating gills, splashing into the pool and against their upturned faces as they anxiously waited.
"Your pardon, Lord," Miss Veronica piped up. "Long has it been since I was privileged to encounter one of your noble race. I am Veronica, a spinner of the wood, attendant of the last remaining root, and this is Edith, whom my sisters and I have taken to be our daughter."
Resting her hand upon the child's shoulder for balance, the old woman executed a clumsy curtsy. The undine let out a long, rumbling sigh and began to sink back into the pool until only the great head remained above the surface.
"Grateful am I to you," the undine said, "measurer of petty destinies. The cold binding shackles are undone at last, and the time of my fettered captivity is over."
"Who did this wicked thing?" Miss Veronica asked.
A deep, rolling growl echoed from the creature's throat.
"My brothers," came the dissonant reply. "They forged for themselves chill flesh in which they left the waters, seeking dominion over the new continents. Yet I would not join them. Enamored of the oceans as I was, the land held no fascination. My rebellion angered them, and so they tethered me with the biting chains of their new raiment. Here have I remained through the endless lonely years."
The eyelids closed, and the corners of the great mouth drooped despondently.
"Now I am eager to return to the blue, boundless seas."
The old woman bowed a second time, and the water spirit slid further into the pool.
"Oi, Fishface!"
Edie suddenly shouted.
"I think you're downright mean and ungrateful," she accused. "Leaving us here like this after we went to all the trouble of letting you go."
"You impudent child!"
Miss Veronica gasped.
"He's not only selfish, but daft as well,"
the girl cried. The undine raised his massive head from the pool.
"What say you?"
he thundered. Edie placed her hands upon her hips. "You're the last one," she said obstinately. "When you leave here, you'll be on your lonesome all over again, with only the likes of sardines and kippers to talk to." The cavern trembled as the water spirit snarled, and the pool churned as his wrath mounted. A dark shadow fell upon Edie Dorkins, but the child simply laughed and snapped her fingers rudely. "Blast and blow all you want," she told him, with a curt toss of the head. "All I wanted was to be friends. If you'd have come back to the museum with us, you could have stayed in the well, and I could have chatted to you every day. But you go off, go swim on your Todd, leave us stranded here where we found you." The very air quivered as her insulting talk angered the ogre of the deep. Then, without warning, the wide mouth opened, and the creature chuckled softly. "I see. You are a keeper of a different kind of sacred spring," he said. "The spirits of the waters are wise beyond your understanding. Yet in you I see the hope of the world. But the wide waters are calling, and I must travel them." With that, his immense head submerged beneath the surface of the pool, and his voice was lost in the bubbling waters. "Get back here!" Edie bawled, leaning over the edge. "Edith!" Miss Veronica yowled. "Look!" Hurrying back to her side, Edie saw that the water within the black bounding boulders was bubbling and beginning to spill over the stones. Over the frozen ground it flowed, flooding past their feet to swash against the furthest walls. Miss Veronica gripped her cane in despair. "We shall never leave this place," she whimpered. "The Undine's heart must have been hardened by the cold." The water was up to Edie's ankles now. "Sooner we get out the better then," she said. "Don't worry, Veronica, it's only a bit of water." "You don't understand," the old woman muttered. "The power of the Undine is behind this deluge." "So?" "He and his kind are mightier than the Nornir," she despaired. "Edith, they were our most bitter enemies. They and their works are capable of destroying us." The water was up to the girl's knees now, and she gazed at Miss Veronica anxiously. "What happens if we can't find a way out?" "Then we're certain to drown," the old woman replied. With growing panic, Edie floundered through the galleries of ice towards the cavern wall, but the glittering halls and corridors had become sluicing rivers. By the time the water had surged up to Edie's neck, she had still not found any means of escape, and she finally abandoned all hope. Sobbing, Miss Veronica threw her arms about her and tried to lift Edie above the raging torrent, but the fierce currents snatched the child from her grasp, and with a howling, terrified scream, Edie Dorkins was dragged down to the dark, seething waters. "No!" Miss Veronica shrieked, and then she, too, was lost. Speeding along the deserted country road, the cold air rushed in through the van's roof, battering against Aidan's grim face. "Please let there still be a chance," he muttered under his breath. As if in answer, he suddenly heard the clamour of repulsive, skirling voices. Down the twisting lanes the vehicle shot, skidding around the sharp bends, but soon the air above was alive with thrashing feathers. Down ripped ravaging beaks, shredding the roof like fragments of paper. Then 4 curved talons ruptured the side windows, hooking around the frame, and Aidan felt the van lurch as it was lifted off the tarmac. Staring up through the torn ceiling, he saw the loathsome Valkyries. Diving between the creatures above, a raven with cunning eyes perched upon the roof.
"What trickery is this?"
Thought cried, when he discovered that the van contained only Aidan.
"Where is my brother?"
A look of defiant recognition crossed Aidan's face. "You must be Thought," he shouted above the rushing wind. The raven spat at him.
"By the slenderest thread dost thy life hang. Naught would give my master's servants greater glee than to let thee fall."
The gypsy laughed. "You were pickled in the museum too long. Otherwise you'd know that threats never work on someone you're going to kill anyway." Incensed, the raven threw back his head to bark out the order for the Valkyries to send their burden hurtling to the ground. But Aidan was no longer looking up at him. He was staring out of the shattered passenger window. Thought followed his glance to see the dark mound of Wyrd Hill. "How "No," he squawked. "Thine eyes betray thee." Aidan turned away quickly, but the raven cackled. "Raging screamer, bear thy charge a little further. We return to Innis Witrin." The atrocities above shrieked their obedience, and the van whirled about as the horde of raven women flew back towards Glastonbury. Gazing out of the windscreen, Aidan saw the small shape of Wyrd Hill grow ever larger as they stormed through the heavens, and hoped that Neil had managed to reach the thorn in time. Situated just short of the summit, the holy thorn was ringed about by hooped railings, its tangled branches resembling a cloud of needles. Just as Neil neared it, 2 circles of light flashed across the hillside. He spun round and spluttered in fright to see Aidan's van swinging high above.
"Master Neil," Quoth squealed. "The thorn! Reach for it!"
Neil staggered towards it, thrust his arms between the rails, and threw them around the tree's gnarled trunk. Upon the grass behind him, Quoth was flung backwards as a brilliant light suddenly burst over the hilltop. The branches of the thorn were erupting with fiery blossom. Every petal crackled and shone, until the whole tree was bathed in one enveloping flame. But despite the intensity of the fires, Neil felt no heat. The Valkyries brayed. The fabulous light pained their eyes, and if they strayed too close to the flame, their feathers smoked. Thought flew amongst them to assuage their panic. Then he suddenly spotted a black dot tottering over the grass.
"The time of judgment is nigh,"
he hissed, thundering down. In a flurry of feathers, Thought landed upon the grass, and Quoth goggled at him.
"Memory," Thought cawed. "I did think ne'er to look upon thy visage again. It pleaseth me greatly to find thee now."
Quoth's beak fell open as his brother's wheedling words stirred images of his past, and he recalled the terrible craving for war and carnage which his former self had revelled in.
"No greater love exists than that of brother for brother," Thought asserted. "Join me, Memory, and we shall feast on victory ever after."
Clinging to the holy thorn, Neil Chapman watched anxiously as his companion wavered. "Quoth!" he shouted. "Don't listen to him!" Steeped in the splendour of the tree's flames, the one-eyed raven glanced back at the boy, then, returning his hooded gaze to his brother, announced, "The bond betwixt us is sundered. Memory didst perish in the mists long ages since. Now I am Quoth, and Zooks hurrah for that!" Neil could have hugged him, but Thought's face contorted with rage, and his eyes burned. He let loose a piercing shriek to the Valkyries high above them.
"Behold then the dire consequence of thy choice."
Neil and Quoth glanced upwards to where Raging and Screamer wheeled above. Suspended from their talons, Aidan's van swung precariously, but hearing their leader's signalling cry, the monstrous creatures slackened their grip. "No!" Neil yelled. With a horrific splintering crunch of metal, the vehicle thundered into the ground. "Aidan!" the boy bawled. Like a rag doll, the gypsy's broken body was thrown out onto the grass. Neil stared at him in despair. "Damn you!" he cursed the raven. Thought gave a chilling chortle as he flew around the tree.
"A fitting punishment," he cried.
At once, Biter descended, with the Reverend Galloway dangling in its clutches, and seeing the man who had danced at his school assembly come swooping out of the night, Neil thought he had finally gone mad. The ground raced up to meet the vicar's feet. "What have you done?" he wailed, when Thought came fluttering towards him. "I want no part of this."
"Faint-hearted worm," Thought shrieked. "Dost thou wish for countless others to perish?"
"You know I don't."
"Then undertake this simplest of tasks."
"What must I do?" Peter asked. Thought swept back to the thorn.
"Remove this whelp,"
he ordered. "He's just a child," the vicar protested.
"Shrink from this one act, and thou art denying thy faith,"
Thought screamed back at him. Peter was tired and shaken, and the raven's raucous urging was subverting his will. "Very well," he found himself saying. "You keep away from me," Neil warned. "You're crazy listening to that bundle of filth. He'll kill us all." But the vicar strode up to the rails and put his hands through them to take hold of the boy's arms. Neil lashed out and kicked him, but eventually the man dragged him away. At once the fiercely blazing blossom withered, and darkness returned to Wyrd Hill.
"Beware!"
Quoth yelped as the horrendous black shapes of the Valkyries came swooping down. A searing pain pinched Neil's shoulders as Hlurk's vicious talons grabbed him, and the boy was torn from the hillside and carried aloft into the night. The Reverend Galloway turned an ashen face to Thought. "What'll it do with him?" he asked. Thought smirked.
"Thee and thy conscience shall not wrestle for much longer."
Spreading his wings, he glided to where Quoth hopped dejectedly upon the grass, whimpering Neil's name.
"Thou hast been spared till the last,"
Thought spat. He rammed his flat head into Quoth's chest, and the startled bird blundered helplessly onto his back. Throwing back his ugly head, Thought prepared to snap his brother's spine. Suddenly, the Valkyries began shrieking more excitably than ever.
"'Tis time!"
Thought cried. Giving Quoth a scornful kick, he flew to Peter's shoulder and shouted in his ear,
"Hark! We must fly! The final moment is come! The golden prize hath been found!"
And so, for the last time, Peter agreed. Seized by Biter, he was swept up into the darkness above. Looking about him, Quoth was horrified to discover that he was lying right next to Aidan's body.
"Neil,"
a weak voice whispered. The raven blinked in astonishment. The man was still alive. Aidan's lips quivered. "Find Tommy." And with those words, the leader of the descendants of Asgard died.
"So passeth a noble knight,"
Quoth mourned. Then he realized the importance of Aidan's dying words. He gave an experimental flap of his wings. Then over the ground he charged, leaping and bounding into the air. To his overwhelming joy, he soon found that he was flying. Taking a circuitous route to avoid the horde of raven women, he made for the Tor. Within the Tower of St. Michael, Tommy sat upon the hard ground, his collection of religious icons spread around him. Suddenly, into his sanctuary, a bundle of feathers came bursting.
"Thou art needed, old man!"
Quoth shrieked.
"The 12 hath made Master Neil captive. He shall be killed lest thou give him aid."
"Tommy can't," the tramp gibbered. "Them bird women will get him."
"Then a curse upon thee!"
Quoth snorted, and shakily took to the air once more. Suspended from Hlurk's powerful claws, with the monstrous Valkyries swooping around him, Neil ceased his struggles. Far below, the lights of Glastonbury appeared as tiny jewels.
"This is the moment for which our master hath waited these long, empty years,"
Thought exulted.
"Behold, down yonder, the witch ascendeth, bringing the instrument of her own destruction."
Neil could see the lane buckling and bulging as some tremendous force pushed it from below. Then into the night spouted a torrent of water. All at once the surging column dwindled, and up from the deep reaches of the earth the last Undine propelled 2 figures into the chill night air. From the frothing fathoms, Miss Veronica and Edie came, gulping for air.
"Say, Veronica,"
Edie began, shaking herself like a dog,
"the Undine weren't bad after all."
Only then did she hear the wild baying calls in the sky, and she lifted her eyes to see the dark winged nightmares slowly descend.
"Struth!"
she squealed.
"What's them things?" "Valkyria!"
Miss Veronica gasped, shivering at the sight of them.
"My captain's most terrible servants."
Taking the glimmering golden circlet from around the child's arm, Miss Veronica flourished it for all to see and hurried towards the tor. Through the overhanging branches, Thought came darting.
"Fairest princess,"
he cried, as he alighted upon the gravestone-like stile.
"1,000 thanks."
As the Valkyries rushed down the slopes of the great mountain, Peter Galloway quivered as he felt the shadowy webs of illusion form about him once again, weaving the image of the young Ascarian captain. With a momentous buffeting gale, as huge wings churned the air, the Valkyries landed, and the false vision of Woden was deposited with the utmost reverence upon the ground. The raven women bowed low to the deluding image. Edie stared at their grotesque shapes and their sharp hooked claws. It was not difficult to imagine the carnage they were capable of, and she wrinkled her nose at the rancid reek which drifted from their repulsive bodies. Miss Veronica hobbled over to her beloved captain with the bracelet in her hands. Peter remembered he was supposed to be dying. "I knew you would not fail me," he murmured with a weary gasp. Miss Veronica blushed.
"I'm not as you remember," she apologized.
Looking through the illusion's eyes, the vicar could see beyond the wizened exterior and glimpsed Miss Veronica's nobility. She had risked everything to save the life of the man she had adored in the days of her youth. "To my eyes you will always be beautiful," Peter found himself saying. Miss Veronica smiled and offered the bejeweled circlet up to him. The bangle's gleam flowed out over the slopes, and the Valkyries hissed in dismay when they saw it.
"Halt!"
shrieked a sudden voice, as Quoth came tumbling into their midst.
"This is not the gallows god!"
The old woman stared at the warrior before her. At once Edie snatched the bracelet from her and stuffed it under her coat. The Valkyries snarled.
"Grumble all thou wilt,"
Quoth shouted back at them.
"Against the Nornir thou art powerless."
Thought's dark eyes blazed. Then he gave a loud cry. Hlurk spiraled slowly down, and in its clutches Edie and Miss Veronica saw kneel.
"If thou dost not obey me,"
Woden's lieutenant threatened,
"the young dog shall plunge to his death. Deliver unto us that most precious object."
Edie looked at Miss Veronica, and the old woman nodded.
"We must,"
she told her simply. "Here," the girl said suddenly, as she pushed the bracelet into Peter's hands. Miss Veronica was looking at the man she had been tricked into believing was Woden, for the illusion was fading. Tears brimmed in her eyes as she beheld him for who he truly was.
"I am a fool, and always have been,"
she whispered bitterly.
"He did love me once, long ago, I'm sure, but a greater love fanned the flames of his heart, his ambition. He sought Ursula out and begged her knowledge, and she is blameless. I see that now."
Peter glanced up briefly to see Hlurk cast kneel upon the ground. Then he returned his gaze to the glittering object in his hands.
"I don't understand," he muttered. "This is a piece of jewelry."
"Unbend the bangle,"
Thought prompted. Peter began to uncurl the coiled piece of gold. The rich encrusted gilding flaked and shattered. There in his hands was a plain, if distorted, spearhead. The raven upon his shoulder screeched with evil laughter.
"Behold, the spear blade of Longinus, the centurion!"
Peter was in no doubt that the object in his hands was the weapon which had pierced the side of the man from Nazareth as he suffered upon the cross. Falling to his knees, the broken man sobbed uncontrollably. Rising above him, Thought squealed with malevolence.
"I hath in mine power the most powerful instrument of destruction there has ever been. No will of thine own dost thou possess,"
Thought hooted at the shivering figure upon the ground.
"Arise, O slave!"
Peter Galloway rose mechanically. Thought's beady glare came to rest upon Miss Veronica. In a forceful, commanding voice he cried,
"Plunge plunge the blade deep into the harridan's breast.
Peter gripped the spear fiercely as he stepped forward, but Neil and Edie pushed between him and Miss Veronica. "Stop this!" the boy yelled. With a brutal sweep of his fist, Peter sent Neil flying, but Edie leapt up to bite the hand which held the blade, only to be knocked violently aside. Miss Veronica staggered back towards the gate as Peter strode after her.
"Kind sir," she said, "I have done no harm to you." "Kill her!" the raven screeched.
Tossing back her head, Miss Veronica threw up her arms to fend off the terrible blow as the spear came stabbing down, but the blade never reached her. A grubby, red-knuckled hand gripped Peter's arm, and a friendly voice spoke from the shadows.
"Why don't you just put that nasty spiker down, old son?"
Edie ran over to Miss Veronica, and the old woman hugged her desperately.
"Tommy!"
Neil cried. To Thort's fury, his newly created slave turned his head to stare at the tramp. Tommy's pale eyes shone softly in the light which glimmered from the spear. Flying from the vicar's shoulder, Thort beat his wings in Peter's face and screamed at him. But whatever Peter Galloway had seen in the tramp's face, it was enough, and his mind was already clearing. He threw back his hand, and the spear went hurtling through the air, straight through the evil raven's heart. Thort was flung back as the spear crunched clean into solid stone, and the raven was impaled against the stile. With a final jerk, his ugly head lolled onto the tarnished metal. The 12 raven women flew from their perches, baying for slaughter. Frantically, Peter Galloway reached for the spear and wrenched it free. "Come on, then," he cried, brandishing the blade above his head. "Who wants to taste this next?" Charging into the enemy's midst, he leapt underneath the first of the Furies as its talons came reaching wildly for him. Peter laughed grimly, thrusting the blade up into the mass of razor-sharp feathers. A hideous scream discharged from the murderous beak as the misshapen brute toppled from the air. Lying upon the grass was the unconscious body of a woman, and, tangled in her hair, were the slashed tatters of a crow doll. "One down!" Peter yelled triumphantly. Edie wanted to run to help him, but 5 more distorted terrors had fixed their unclean sights upon Neil and Tommy. "Get back, you horrors!" Tommy wailed, seizing Miss Veronica's cane and thrashing it in the malformed, feather-framed faces as the ferocious claws gripped his coat and started to drag and pull at him. Edie ran to his aid, and the Valkyries shied away from the fey, sprite-like child, for the forces of doom sparkled in her pixie hood, and they dared not attack her. Peter was totally obscured by the screeching monsters, yet in the midst of that furious mass of hate and malice, the spear sliced arcs of light, and the grass smouldered where the poisonous Valkyrie blood splashed. From the clamouring mob there came a curdling yowl, and another of the feathered ogres crashed onto the ground, shortly followed by a third. But Peter's strength was failing. Lashing out feverishly, he ripped the blade through a flailing wing, but the creature hit out fiercely with its claws. The blade went spinning from his grasp. High overhead, the enchanted blade catapulted before plummeting down and embedding itself in the soft mud of the trackway behind them. Neil bolted through the stile to retrieve it, and Quoth flew after him. Hearing the vicar's howl of pain, Edie whirled around and gasped to see the hideous raven women clawing at his body. Hollering, she barged across the slope. The foul creatures hissed their displeasure, but fell back all the same. Edie knelt by Peter's battered figure, but she was too late. He was dead. Glimmering in the darkness, the spear's upturned blade pulsed and shone, and Neil dashed down the path to fetch it. But before he had run 3 steps, her lurk swooped through the trees. Neil could feel the creature's putrid breath blast upon his neck. With a barbarous snarl, the Valkyrie's powerful beak smashed against his skull, and the boy collapsed, senseless, onto the path.
"Master Neil!"
Quoth yelped, but the boy did not move. The raven glanced fearfully back to where 2 of the Valkyries were driving Tommy away from the stile, where Miss Veronica stood alone and anxious. Edie Dorkins looked up from the Reverend Galloway to see her lurk circle overhead, croaking its instructions, and, to her astonishment, the other raven women reared up in answer and came lumbering towards her. The girl narrowed her eyes and rose to stand her ground, but this time they refused to be cowed. "Here, child!" Miss Veronica called. "Hurry!" Edie fled back to her, and the feathered nightmares charged after. Quoth approached the glimmering blade, yet the weapon had embedded itself firmly in the soft ground, so that the blade pointed upwards, and the sharp edges cut his feet when he tried to clasp it. Then Aidan's dying words came to him once more. Darting through the trees, he flew to where the tramp was beset by biter and screamer, and landed upon the tramp's shoulder. "Old one," quoth squawked in his ear, "hearken to me!" Screamer's talons tore through Tommy's forearm, gouging a savage wound in his skin. The tramp wept with the agony and stumbled back, but quoth yelled, "Save us all! Thou hast the power! Why couldst thou remove the crow doll when no other could? What is thy hidden secret?" "Tommy doesn't know," he wailed. "Send him angels." Quoth hooted with joy, "I have it! Thy tale of the battle where thou didst see the shining ones. 'Tis all true. Thou wast not a foot soldier. Thou art thyself a shining one, stranded in human flesh. Tommy, thou art the angel." His face streaming with blood, the tramp stared at the raven. But it was too late. Screamer and biter slammed into him, and Tommy fell to the ground. As the baying, trampling Valkyries feasted upon his flesh, Tommy's shrieks were lost. Away from the terrible scene of slaughter, Edie Dorkins and Miss Veronica flinched from the gathered monstrosities, which screeched and squalled before them, and edged through the stile. "What's happening?" Edie cried.
"They're driving us back down the tor,"
Miss Veronica answered. "But why?" The old woman shook her head. Close by, Edie could see Neil Chapman lying unconscious in the mud, and a little way ahead. "Veronica!" she cried. "Look!" The old woman stared down the track and sharply drew her breath when she saw what awaited them.
"By the great ash!" she exclaimed.
With its tip pointing to the sky, the spearhead they had gone through so much to find shone coldly. The atrocities whipped each other into a greater frenzy than ever before, and their claws smashed into the prisoners. Screaming, Edie fell sprawling towards the waiting, glistening blade. But at that moment, the entire tor shook. Upon the grassy slopes, biter and screamer were suddenly catapulted into the air. Into the darkness a brilliant pinnacle of light went shooting, and from the ground a vast billowing cloud swelled. Within its vapour a colossal vision took shape. 3 silhouettes snaked and coiled, and from the haze one of the golden horn-crowned heads exploded. A pair of hook-clawed wings unfurled with a sound like rolling thunder. Fiery eyes burned in that dragon-like head, and from the gaping lips torrents of flame cascaded. So was the angel that had descended to the world in 1915 finally released from the form it had assumed. A mighty gold-armoured tail wrapped itself about the summit of the tor as the angel's searing eyes glowered down. Screamer and biter were stricken with terror, but from the celestial being there was no escape. From one set of fiery jaws there hailed a tempest of flame, and the 2 Valkyries were utterly swallowed in a mesh of light. Out of the sky the human hosts dropped, and the controlling dolls squealed shrilly as they were devoured by the hallowed fires. The remaining raven women burst through the trees. Yet terrible though they were, Woden's grotesque servants were no match for this one marooned member of the heavenly host. The sky was filled with flame as the Valkyries withered and were consumed. With a shattering crunch, her lurk crashed onto the ground, then melted, and the plump figure of Lauren Humphreys lay insensible across the furrows. The 12 were conquered at last. Above the tor, the wondrous vision of the angel lifted its heads to unleash a tremendous bellowing roar, and, silhouetted before its golden magnificence, a tiny black speck dared to sing and squawk in gladness. "Zooks hurrah! Zooks hurroosh!" quoth warbled in delight. Groggily, Neil gazed up at the momentous being rearing above the hillside. Then The boy wrenched his attention away, for a desolate, soul-rending sob came to his ears, and he looked down the path to where Edie Dorkins was crouched. Great tears were tumbling from the child's almond eyes as she knelt in the soft earth. "Edie?" Neil murmured, a dreadful fear coming over him. "What's wrong?" The girl did not answer, and as the boy drew near he understood why. Miss Veronica Webster's frail figure lay motionless upon the path. Edie had lifted her wizened head onto her lap and was sobbing uncontrollably over her, stroking the old woman's long, dyed tresses. When those things threw me down, she pushed me out of the way." Neil gazed down at Miss Veronica and closed his eyes at the sight of the spear blade, which was sticking up through the flimsy white robe that was now stained with her royal blood. "She slipped," Edie cried. "Slipped and fell on it instead. Oh, help me! I can't lift her off it." Gravely, Neil slid his hands under the old woman's shoulders and gently raised her from the ground as Edie pulled the spear from Miss Veronica's back. "There now," the child sniffed, dragging the pixie hood from her head and dabbing it on the wound in the vain hope it would staunch the blood. As she bent over her, Quoth flitted down to join them and hung his head in sorrow. A faint breath floated from Miss Veronica's lips, and the webbed eyes fluttered open.
"Edith," she uttered in a barely audible whisper, "the spear has done its work."
The fingers of the old woman's hand twitched feebly, and Edie clasped it in her own.
"Tell her,"
Miss Veronica breathed with difficulty.
"Tell Ursula I'm sorry. I forgive her."
"Don't go," Edie wept. Thus the youngest and once most beautiful of the three fates of the ancient world perished. A fierce rush of wind tore about the lower slopes, and the ground shuddered. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the angel was gone, and darkness reclaimed the night. Feeling utterly lost and alone, the boy gazed at the young girl grieving over Miss Veronica's body, and knew that an ending that should never have occurred had come to pass. Nothing would ever be the same again. The structured order of things was broken. As Neil lowered his eyes, a feathered head gently rested against his cheek. Below the foundations of the Wyrd Museum, within the chamber of Nirinel, Miss Ursula Webster waited for the moment which she knew must come. Then it happened. A hideous pain ripped through her breast, at precisely the same moment as the spear blade stabbed into Miss Veronica, far away in Glastonbury. Crying out, Miss Ursula fell to the ground, gasping and weeping as she experienced her sister's dying moments. Above her, the last root of Yggdrasil trembled ominously, and a deep, resonant groan reverberated throughout the chamber. Miss Selenine's hysterical screams rang from their small apartment until a tremendous splitting of stone and metal abruptly drowned out her wails. The grand Victorian entrance to the Wyrd Museum was shuddering, and one of the bronze figures which flanked the oaken door suddenly toppled from its plinth and went crashing to the ground. Through the curling fog a hooded figure came, the profound shadows beneath its cowl fixed intently upon the broken fragments of sculpture, and a faint sigh hissed from his unseen lips. "The dandy is no more," the sepulchral voice murmured. "The witches of the loom are divided at last. Soon Skuld and the mighty Ordor herself will fall victim. Such is the will of Woden." Turning, the sinister figure melted into the consuming gloom.